86. Multiple hypothesis testing. International news headlines of April 7th, 1992. Toronto Magical Tribune. Entire British Wisengamot reports seeing boy who lived, frighten a Dementor expert on magical creatures. Now you're just lying. France, Germany accuse Britain of making the whole thing up. New Zealand spellcrafters diurnal notice. What drove British legislature insane? Could our government be next? Experts list top 28 reasons to believe it's already happened. American mage. Werewolf clan to become first inhabitants of Wyoming. The Quibbler. Malfoy flees Hogwarts as Vila powers awaken. Daily Prophet. Legal tricks free. Mad Muggleborn as Potter threatens ministry with attack on Azkaban hypothesis. Voldemort, April 8th, 1992, 7:22 p.m. The four of them gathered once more around the ancient desk of the headmaster of Hogwarts, with its drawers within drawers within drawers, wherein all the past paperwork of the Hogwarts school was stored. Legend had it that headmistress Shayla had once gotten lost in that desk, and was, in fact, still there, and wouldn't be let out again until she got her files organized. Minerva didn't particularly look forward to inheriting those drawers when she inherited that desk someday, if any of them survived. Albus Dumbledore was seated behind his desk, looking grave and composed. Severus Snape was standing next to the dead Floo and its ashes, hovering ominously like the vampire that students sometimes accused him of pretending to be. Mad-Eye Moody had been meant to join them, but was yet to arrive. And Harry. A boy's small, thin frame, perched on the arm of his chair, as though the energies running through him were too great to allow ordinary seating. Set face, sweaty hair, intent green eyes, and within it all, the jagged lightning bolt of his never-healing scar. He seemed grimmer now, even compared to a single week earlier. For a moment, Minerva flashed back to her trip to Diagon Alley with Harry, what seemed like ages and ages ago. There had been this somber boy inside that Harry somehow, even then. This wasn't entirely her own fault, or Albus's fault. And yet there was something almost unbearably sad about the contrast between the young boy she'd first met and what magical Britain had made of him. Harry had never had much of an ordinary childhood, she'd gathered. Harry's adoptive parents had said to her that he'd spoken little and played less with Muggle children. It was painful to think that Harry might have had only a few months of playing beside the other children in Hogwarts before the war's demands had stripped it all away. Maybe there was another face that Harry showed to the children his own age when he wasn't staring down the Wisengamot. But she couldn't stop herself from imagining Harry Potter's childhood as a heap of firewood, and herself and Albus feeding the wooden branches, piece by piece, into the flames. Prophecies are strange things, said Albus Dumbledore. The old wizard's eyes were half-lidded, as though in weariness. Vague, unclear, meaning escaping like water held between loose fingers. Prophecy is ever a burden, for there are no answers there, only questions. Harry Potter was sitting tensely. Headmaster Dumbledore, said the boy with soft precision, my friends are being targeted. Hermione Granger almost went to Azkaban. The war has begun, as you put it. Professor Trelawney's prophecy is key information for weighing up the balance of my hypotheses about what's going on. Not to mention how silly it is, and dangerous, that the Dark Lord knows the prophecy, and I don't. Albus looked a grim question at her, and she shook her head in reply. In whatever unimaginable way, Harry had discovered that Trelawney had made the prophecy, and that the Dark Lord knew of it. He hadn't learned that much from her. Voldemort, seeking to avert that very prophecy, went to his defeat at your hands, the old wizard said then. His knowledge brought him only harm. Ponder that carefully, Harry Potter. Yes, headmaster, I do understand that. My home culture also has a literary tradition of self-fulfilling and misinterpreted prophecies. I'll interpret with caution, rest assured. But I've already guessed quite a bit. Is it safer for me to work from partial guesses? Time passed. Minerva, said Albus. If you would. The one, she began. The words came falteringly to her throat. She was no actress. She couldn't imitate the deep, chilling tone of the original prophecy, and yet somehow that tone seemed to carry all the meaning. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches. Born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies. And the Dark Lord shall mark him as his equal, came Severus's voice, making her jump within her chair. The potion's master loomed tall by the fireplace, but he shall have power the Dark Lord knows not. and either must destroy all but a remnant of the other, for those two different spirits cannot exist in the same world. That last line Severus spoke with so much foreboding that it chilled her bones. It was almost like listening to Sybil Trelawney. Harry was listening with a frown. "Can you repeat that?" said Harry. "The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born is the 7th month. Actually, hold on, can you write that down? I need to analyze this carefully." This was done, with both Albus and Severus watching the parchment hawk-like, as though to make sure that no unseen hand reached in and snatched the precious information away. "Let's see," Harry said. "I'm male and born on July 31st, check. I did in fact vanquish the Dark Lord, check. Ambiguous pronoun in line 2, but I wasn't born yet, so it's hard to see how my parents could have thrice defied me. This scar is an obvious candidate for the mark." Harry touched his forehead. "Then there's the power the Dark Lord knows not, which probably refers to my scientific background." "No," said Severus. Harry looked at the potion's master in surprise. Severus's eyes were closed, his face tightened in concentration. "The Dark Lord could obtain that power by studying the same books as you, Potter. But the prophecy did not say, 'Power the Dark Lord has not,' nor even, 'Power the Dark Lord cannot have.' She spoke of power the Dark Lord knows not. It will be something stranger to him than Muggle artifacts, something perhaps that he cannot comprehend at all, even having seen it." "Science is not a bag of technological tricks," Harry said. "It's not just the Muggle version of a wand. It's not even knowledge like memorizing the periodic table. It's a different way of thinking." "Perhaps," the potion's master murmured, but his voice was skeptical. "It is hazardous," Albus said, "to read too far into a prophecy, even if you have heard it yourself. They are things of exceeding frustration." "So I see," Harry said. His hand rose up, rubbed the scar on his forehead. "But, okay, if this is really all we know. Look, I'll just put it bluntly. How do you know that the Dark Lord actually survived?" "What?" she cried. Albus just sighed and leaned back in the vast headmaster's chair. "Well," Harry said, "imagine how this prophecy sounded back when it was made. You know who learns the prophecy, and it sounds like I'm destined to grow up and overthrow him, that the two of us are meant to have a final battle where either of us must destroy all but a remnant of the other. So you know who attacks Godric's Hollow and immediately gets vanquished, leaving behind some remnant which may or may not be his disembodied soul. Maybe the Death Eaters are his remnant, or the Dark Mark. This prophecy could already be fulfilled, is what I'm saying. Don't get me wrong, I do realize that my interpretation sounds stretched. Trelawney's phrasing doesn't seem natural for describing only the events that historically happened on October 31st, 1981. Attacking a baby and having the spell bounce off isn't something you'd normally call the power to vanquish. But if you think of the prophecy as being about several possible futures, only one of which was actually realized on Halloween, then the prophecy could already be complete. But Minerva blurted, "But the raid on Azkaban. If the Dark Lord survived, then sure, he's the most likely suspect for the Azkaban breakout," Harry said reasonably. "You could even say that the Azkaban breakout is Bayesian evidence for the Dark Lord surviving, because an Azkaban breakout is more likely to happen in worlds where he's alive than worlds where he's dead. But it's not strong Bayesian evidence. It's not something that can't possibly happen unless the Dark Lord is alive." Professor Quirrell, who didn't start from the assumption that you know who was still around, had no trouble thinking of his own explanation. To him, it was obvious that some powerful wizard might want Bellatrix black because she knew a secret of the Dark Lord's, like some of his magical knowledge that he'd told to only her. The priors against anyone surviving their body's death are very low, even if it's magically possible. Most times it doesn't happen. So if it's just the Azkaban breakout, I'd have to say formally that it isn't enough Bayesian evidence. Improbability of the evidence assuming that the hypothesis is false is not commensurate with the prior improbability of the hypothesis. "No," Severus said flatly, "the prophecy is not yet fulfilled. I would know if it were." "Are you sure of that?" "Yes, Potter. If the prophecy had already come true, I would understand it. I heard Trelawney's words, I remember Trelawney's voice, and if I knew the events that match the prophecy, I would recognize them. What has already happened does not fit." The potion's master spoke with certainty. I'm not really sure what to do with that statement, Harry said. His hand rose up, absently rubbed at his forehead. Maybe it's just what you think happened that doesn't fit, and the true history is different. Voldemort is alive, Albus said. There are other indications. Such as? Harry's reply was instant. Albus paused. There are terrible rituals by which wizards have returned from death, Albus said slowly. That much anyone can discern within history and legend. And yet those books are missing. I could not find them. It was Voldemort who removed them, I am sure. So you can't find any books on immortality, and that proves that you know who has them. Indeed, said Albus. There is a certain book, I will not name it aloud, missing from the restricted section of the Hogwarts library. An ancient scroll which should have been at Borgin and Burke's, with only an empty place on a shelf to show where it was, the old wizard stopped. But I suppose, the old wizard said, as though to himself, you will say that even if Voldemort tried to make himself immortal, it does not prove that he succeeded. Harry sighed. Proof, headmaster. There are only ever probabilities. If there are known, particular books on immortality rituals which are missing, that increases the probability that someone attempted one, which, in turn, raises the prior probability of the Dark Lord surviving his death. This I concede, and thank you for contributing the fact. The question is whether the prior probability goes up enough. Surely, Albus said quietly, if you concede even a chance that Voldemort survived, that is worth guarding against. Harry inclined his head. As you say, headmaster, though once a probability drops low enough, it's also an error to go on obsessing about it. Given that books on immortality are missing, and that this prophecy would sound somewhat more natural if it refers to the Dark Lord, and I having a future battle, I agree that the Dark Lord being alive is a probability, not just possibility. But other probabilities must also be taken into account, and in the probable worlds where you know who is not alive, someone else framed Hermione. Foolishness, Severus said softly. Utter foolishness. The dark mark has not faded, nor has its master. See, that's what I mean by formally insufficient Bayesian evidence. Sure, it sounds all grim and foreboding and stuff, but is it that unlikely for a magical mark to stay around after the maker dies? Suppose the mark is certain to continue, while the Dark Lord's sentience lives on. But a priori we'd only have guessed a 20% chance of the dark mark continuing to exist after the Dark Lord dies. Then the observation, the dark mark has not faded, is 5 times as likely to occur in worlds where the Dark Lord is alive as in worlds where the Dark Lord is dead. Is that really commensurate with the prior improbability of immortality? Let's say the prior odds were 100 to 1 against the Dark Lord surviving. If a hypothesis is 100 times as likely to be false versus true, and then you see evidence 5 times more likely if the hypothesis is true versus false, you should update to believing the hypothesis is 20 times as likely to be false as true. Odds of 100 to 1 times a likelihood ratio of 1 to 5 equals odds of 20 to 1 that the Dark Lord is dead. Where are you getting all these numbers, Potter? That is the admitted weakness of the method, Harry said readily. But what I'm qualitatively getting at is why the observation, the dark mark has not faded, is not adequate support for the hypothesis. The Dark Lord is immortal. The evidence isn't as extraordinary as the claim. Harry paused. Not to mention that even if the Dark Lord is alive, he doesn't have to be the one who framed Hermione. As a cunning man once said, there could be more than one plotter and more than one plan. Such as the defense professor, Severus said with a thin smile. I suppose I must agree that he is a suspect. It was the defense professor last year, after all, and the year before that, and the year before that. Harry's eyes dropped back to the parchment in his lap. Let's move on. Are we certain that this prophecy is accurate? Nobody messed with Professor McGonagall's memory, maybe edited or subtracted a line. Albus paused, then spoke slowly. There is a great spell laid over Britain, recording every prophecy said within our borders. Far beneath the most ancient hall of the Wisengamot, in the Department of Mysteries, they are recorded. The Hall of Prophecy, Minerva whispered. She'd read about that place, said to be a great room of shelves filled with glowing orbs, one after another appearing over the years. Merlin himself had wrought it, it was said, the greatest wizard's final slap to the face of fate. Not all prophecies conduce to the good, and Merlin had wished for at least those spoken of in prophecy, to know what had been spoken of them. That was the respect Merlin had given to their free will, that destiny might not control them from the outside, unwitting. Those mentioned within a prophecy would have a glowing orb float to their hand, and then hear the prophet's true voice speaking. Others who tried to touch an orb, it was said, would be driven mad, or possibly just have their heads explode. The legends were unclear on this point. Whatever Merlin's original intention, the unspeakables hadn't let anyone enter in centuries, so far as she'd heard. Works of the ancient wizards had stated that later unspeakables had discovered that tipping off the subjects of prophecies could interfere with seers, releasing whatever temporal pressures they released. And so the heirs of Merlin had sealed his hall. It did occur to Minerva to wonder, now that she'd spent a few months around Mr. Potter, how anyone could possibly know that. But she also knew better than to ask Albus, in case Albus tried to tell her. Minerva firmly believed that you only ought to worry about time if you were a clerk. The Hall of Prophecy, Albus confirmed lowly. Those who are spoken of in a prophecy may listen to that prophecy there. Do you see the implication, Harry? Harry frowned. Well, I could listen to it, or the Dark Lord. Oh, my parents, those who had thrice defied him. They were also mentioned in the prophecy, so they could hear the recording. If James and Lily heard anything different from what Minerva reported, Albus said evenly, they did not say so to me. You took James and Lily there, Minerva said. Fox can go to many places, Albus said. Do not mention the fact. Harry was staring directly at Albus. Can I go to this department of Mystery's place and hear the recorded prophecy? The original tone of voice might be helpful from what I've heard. Light glinted from the reflection of Albus's half-moon glasses as the old wizard slowly shook his head. I think that would be unwise, Albus said, for reasons beyond the obvious. It is dangerous, that place which Merlin made, more dangerous to some people than others. I see, Harry said tonelessly, and looked back down at the parchment. I'll take the prophecy as assumed accurate for now. The next part says that the Dark Lord has marked me as his equal. Any ideas on what that means exactly? Surely not, said Albus, that you must imitate his ways in any wise. I'm not dumb, headmaster. Muggles have worked out a thing or two about temporal paradoxes, even if it's all theoretical to them. I won't throw away my ethics just because a signal from the future claims it's going to happen, because then that becomes the only reason why it happened in the first place. Still, what does it mean? I do not know, said Severus. Nor I, she said. Harry took out his wand, turned it over in his hands, gazing meditatively at the wood. 11 inches, Harley, with a core of phoenix feather, Harry said. And the phoenix whose tail feather is in this wand only ever gave one other, which Mr. What was his name? Olive something. Made into the core of the Dark Lord's wand. And I'm a Parselmouth. It seemed like a lot of coincidence even then. And now I find out there's a prophecy stating that I'll be the Dark Lord's equal. Severus's eyes were thoughtful, the headmaster's gaze unreadable. Could it be, Minerva said falteringly, that you-know-who, that Voldemort transferred some of his own powers to Mr. Potter, the night he gave him that scar? Not something he intended to do, surely. Still, I don't see how Mr. Potter could be his equal if he had any less magic than the Dark Lord himself. Meh, said Harry, still looking meditatively at his wand. I'd fight the Dark Lord without any magic at all, if I had to. Homo sapiens didn't become the dominant species on this planet by having the sharpest claws or hardest armor, though I suppose some of that point may be lost on wizards. Still, it's beneath my dignity as a human being to be scared of anything that isn't smarter than I am. And from what I've heard, on that particular dimension, the Dark Lord wasn't very scary. The potion's master spoke, his voice taking on some of his customary contemptuous drawl. You imagine yourself more intelligent than the Dark Lord, Potter. Yes, in fact, said Harry, pulling back the left sleeve of his robes and rolling up the shirt sleeve beneath to expose the bare elbow. Oh, that reminds me. Let's make sure nobody here has the clearly visible tattoo in the standard, easily checkable location, which would mark them as a secret enemy spy. Albus made a quieting gesture that halted the potion's master before he could say anything scathing. Tell me, Harry, Albus said, how would you have crafted the dark mark? Non-standard locations, Harry said promptly, not easily found without embarrassment and fuss, though of course any security-conscious person would check anyway. Make it smaller if possible. Overlay another non-magical tattoo to obscure the exact shape better yet. Cover it with a layer of fake skin. Cunning indeed, Albus said. But tell me, suppose you could craft any conditions you wished into the mark, fading it or raising it as you wished. What would you do then? Make it completely invisible at all times, Harry said in tones of stating the obvious. You don't want there to be any detectable difference between a spy and a non-spy. Suppose you are more cunning still, Albus said. You are a master of trickery, a master of deception, and you employ your abilities to the fullest. Well, the boy stopped, frowning. It seems unnecessarily complicated, more like a tactic a villain would use in a role-playing game than something you'd try in a real-life war. But I suppose you could put fake dark marks on people who aren't really Death Eaters, and keep the dark marks on the real Death Eaters invisible. But then there's the question of why people would start believing in the first place that the dark mark identified a Death Eater. I'd have to think about it for at least 5 minutes if I were going to take the problem seriously. I ask you this, Albus said, still in that mild tone, because I did indeed, in the early days of the war, perform such tests as you suggested. The order survived my folly only because Alistair did not trust in the bare arms we saw. I had thought, afterward, that the bearers of the mark might hide it or show it at their will. And yet when we hied Igor Karkaroff before the Wisengamot, that mark showed clear on his arm, for all that Karkaroff wished to protest his innocence. What true rule may govern the dark mark, I do not know. Even Severus is still bound by his mark not to reveal its secrets to any who do not know them. Oh, well, that makes it obvious, Harry said promptly. Wait, hold on, you were a Death Eater. Harry transferred his stare to Severus. Severus returned a thin smile. I still am, so far as they know. Harry, said Albus, eyes only for the boy. What do you mean? That makes it obvious. Information Theory 101, the boy said in a lecturing tone. Observing variable x conveys information about variable y. If and only if the possible values of x have different probabilities, given different states of y, the instant you hear about anything whatsoever that varies between a spy and a non-spy, you should immediately think of exploiting it to distinguish spies from non-spies. Similarly, to distinguish reality from lies, you need a process which behaves differently in the presence of truth and falsehood. That's why faith doesn't work as a discriminant, while make experimental predictions and test them does. You say someone with the dark mark can't reveal its secrets to anyone who doesn't already know them. So to find out how the dark mark operates, write down every way you can imagine the dark mark might work. Then watch Professor Snape try to tell each of those things to a confederate maybe one who doesn't know what the experiment is about. I'll explain binary search later so that you can play 20 questions to narrow things down. And whatever he can't say out loud is true. His silence would be something that behaves differently in the presence of true statements about the mark versus false statements, you see. Minerva's mouth was hanging open, she realized, and she closed it abruptly. Even Albus looked surprised. And after that, like I said, any behavioral difference between spies and non-spies can be used to identify spies. Once you've identified at least one magically censored secret of the dark mark, you can test someone for the dark mark by seeing if they can reveal that secret to somebody who doesn't already know it. Thank you, Mr. Potter. Everyone looked at Severus. The potion's master was straightening, his teeth bared in a grimace of angry triumph. Headmaster, I can now speak freely of the mark. If we know we are caught for a Death Eater, before others who have not yet seen our bare arms, our mark reveals itself whether we will it or no. But if they have already seen our arms bare, it does not reveal itself, nor if we are only being tested from suspicion. Thus the dark mark seems to identify Death Eaters, but only those already found, you perceive. Ah, Albus said. Thank you, Severus. He closed his eyes briefly. That would indeed explain why Black escaped even Peter's notice. Ah, well, and Harry's proposed test. The potion's master shook his head. The Dark Lord was no fool despite Potter's delusions. The moment such a test is suspected, the mark ceases to bind our tongues. Yet I could not hint at the possibility, but only wait for another to deduce it. Another thin smile. I would award you a good many house points, Mr. Potter, if it would not compromise my cover. But as you can see, the Dark Lord was quite cunning. His gaze grew more distant. Oh, Severus breathed. He was very cunning indeed. Harry Potter sat still for a long moment. Then, no, Harry said. The boy shook his head. No, that can't actually be true. First of all, we're talking about the kind of logic puzzle that would appear in chapter 1 of a Raymond Smullyan book, nowhere near the level of what Muggle scientists do for a living. And second, for all I know, it took the Dark Lord 5 months of thinking to invent the puzzle I just solved in 5 seconds. Is it that inconceivable to you, Potter, that anyone could be so intelligent as yourself? The potion's master's voice held more curiosity than scorn. It's called a base rate, Professor Snape. The evidence is equally compatible with the Dark Lord inventing that puzzle over the course of 5 months or over the course of 5 seconds. But in any given population, there will be many more people who can do it in 5 months than in 5 seconds. Harry pasted a hand against his forehead. Darn it, how can I explain this? I suppose, from your perspective, the Dark Lord came up with a clever puzzle, and I cleverly solved it, and that makes us look equal. I remember your first day of potions class, the potions master said dryly. I think you have a ways still to go. Peace, Severus, Albus said. Harry has already accomplished more than you know. Yet tell me, Harry, why do you believe the Dark Lord is less than you? Surely he is a damaged soul in many ways. But cunning for cunning, you are not yet ready to face him, I would judge, and I know the full tally of your deeds. The frustrating thing about this conversation was that Harry couldn't say his actual reasons for disagreeing, which violated several basic principles of cooperative discourse. He couldn't explain how Bellatrix had really been removed from Azkaban, not by you-know-who in any guise, but by the combined wits of Harry and Professor Quirrell. Harry didn't want to say in front of Professor McGonagall that the existence of brain damage implied that there were no such things as souls, which made a successful immortality ritual. Well, not impossible. Harry certainly intended to forge a road to magical immortality someday, but it would be a lot harder and require much more ingenuity than just binding an already existent soul to a Lix phylactery, which no intelligent wizard would bother doing in the first place if they knew their souls were immortal. And the true and honest reason Harry knew the Dark Lord couldn't have been that smart. Well, there wasn't any tactful way to say it, but Harry had been to a convocation of the Wisengamot. He'd seen the laughable security precautions, if you could call them that, guarding the deepest levels of the Ministry of Magic. They didn't even have the thief's downfall, which goblins used to wash away polyjuice and imperious curses on people entering Gringotts. The obvious takeover route would be to Imperius the Minister of Magic and a few department heads, and owl a hand grenade to anyone too powerful to Imperius. Or owl them knockout gas, if you needed them alive, and in a state of living death to take hares for polyjuice potions. Legilimency, false memories, the confundus charm. It was ridiculous. The magical world was supersaturated with ways to cheat. Harry might not do any of those things himself during his own takeover of Britain, since he was constrained by ethics. Well, Harry might do some of the lesser ones, since polyjuice or a temporary confundus or read-only legilimency all sounded better than an extra day of Azkaban. But if Harry hadn't been constrained by ethics, it was possible he could have wiped out the eviler sections of the Wisengamot that day, all by himself, using only a first year's magical power, on account of being clever enough to figure out Dementors. Though Harry might not have been in such a great political position after that, the surviving Wisengamot members might have found it easy and cheap to disavow his actions for PR purposes and condemn him, even if the smarter ones realized it was for the greater good. But still, if you were completely unrestrained by ethics, armed with the ancient secrets of Salazar Slytherin, had dozens of powerful followers, including Lucius Malfoy, and it took you more than 10 years to fail to overthrow the government of magical Britain, it meant you were stupid. How can I put this? Harry said. Look, headmaster, you've got ethics. There's a lot of battle tactics you don't use because you're not evil. And you fought the Dark Lord, a tremendously powerful wizard who wasn't so restrained, and you held him off anyway. If you know who had been super smart on top of that, you'd be dead. All of you. You'd have died instantly. Harry, Professor McGonagall said. Her voice was faltering. Harry, we almost did all die. More than half the Order of the Phoenix died. If not for Albus Dumbledore, the greatest wizard in 2 centuries, Harry, we surely would have perished. Harry passed a hand across his forehead. I'm sorry, Harry said. I'm not trying to minimize what you went through. I know that you know who was a completely evil, incredibly powerful dark wizard with dozens of powerful followers, and that's bad, yes, definitely bad. It's just all that isn't on remotely the same threat scale as the enemy being smart, in which case they transfigure botulinum toxin and sneak a millionth of a gram into your teacup. Was there any safe way to convey that concept without citing specifics? Harry couldn't think of one. Please, Harry, said Professor McGonagall. Please, Harry, I beg you, take the Dark Lord seriously. He is more dangerous than the senior witch seemed to be having trouble finding words. He is far more dangerous than transfiguration. Harry's eyebrows went up before he could stop himself. A dark chuckle came from Severus Snape's direction. Said the voice of Ravenclaw within him. Honestly, Professor McGonagall is right. We're not taking this as seriously as we take a scientific problem. The difficult thing is to react at all to new information, instead of just flushing it out the window. Right now it looks like we didn't shift belief at all after encountering an unexpected, important argument. Our dismissal of Lord Voldemort as a serious threat was originally based on the Darkmark being blatantly stupid. It would require a focused effort to de-update and suspect the whole garden path of reasoning we went down based on that false assumption, and we're not putting in that effort right now. All right, Harry said, just as Professor McGonagall seemed to be about to speak again. All right, to take this seriously, I need to stop and think for 5 minutes. Please do, said Albus Dumbledore. Harry closed his eyes. His Ravenclaw side divided into 3. Probability estimate, said Ravenclaw 1, who was acting as moderator, that the Dark Lord is alive and as smart as we are, and hence a genuine threat. Why aren't all his enemies already dead? Said Ravenclaw 2, who was prosecuting. Note, said Ravenclaw 1, we had already thought of that argument, so we can't use it to shift belief again each time we rehearse it. But what's the actual flaw in the logic? Said Ravenclaw 2. In worlds with a smart Lord Voldemort, everyone in the Order of the Phoenix died in the first 5 minutes of the war. The world doesn't look like that, so we don't live in that world. Ked, is that really certain? Asked Ravenclaw 3, who'd been appointed as the defender. Maybe there was some reason Lord Voldemort wasn't fighting all out back then, like what? Demanded Ravenclaw 2. Furthermore, whatever your excuse, I demand that the probability of your hypothesis be penalized in accordance with its added complexity. Let 3 talk, said Ravenclaw 1. Okay. Look, said Ravenclaw 3. First of all, we don't know that anyone can take over the ministry just with mind control. Maybe magical Britain is really an oligarchy, and you need enough military power to intimidate the family heads into submission, imperious them too, interjected Ravenclaw 2. And the oligarchs have thief's downfall in the entrances to their home's complexity penalty, cried Ravenclaw 2, more epicycles. Oh, be reasonable, said Ravenclaw 3. We haven't actually seen anyone taking over the ministry with a couple of well-placed imperious curses. We don't know that it can actually be done that easily. But said Ravenclaw 2, even taking that into account, it really seems like there should have been some other way. 10 years of failure, really. Using only conventional terrorist tactics. That's just not even trying. Maybe Lord Voldemort did have more creative ideas, replied Ravenclaw 3, but he didn't want to tip his hand to other countries' governments, didn't want them to know how vulnerable they were, and install thief's downfall in their ministries. Not until he had Britain as a base, and enough servants to subvert all the other major governments simultaneously. You're assuming he wants to conquer the whole world, noted Ravenclaw 2. Trelawney prophesied that he would be our equal, intoned Ravenclaw 3 solemnly. Therefore, he wanted to take over the world. And if he is your equal, and you do have to fight him, for an instant, Harry's mind tried to imagine the specter of 2 creative wizards fighting an all-out war against each other. Harry had noted all the charms and potions in his first-year books that could be creatively used to kill people. He hadn't been able to help himself, literally. He tried to stop his brain from doing it each time, but it was like looking at a fish and trying to stop your brain from noticing it was a fish. What someone could creatively do with 7th year or aura level or ancient lost magic such as Lord Voldemort had possessed, didn't bear thinking about. A magically superpowered creative genius psychopath wasn't a threat. It was an extinction event. Then Harry shook his head, dismissing the gloomy line his reasoning had been going down. The question was whether there was a significant probability of facing anything so terrible as a dark rationalist in the first place. Prior odds that someone attempting an immortality ritual would actually have it work. Call it 1 to 1,000, at a generous overestimate. It was not the case that roughly one wizard in 1,000 survived their death. Though admittedly Harry didn't have data on how many had attempted immortality rituals first. What if the Dark Lord is as smart as us? Said Ravenclaw 3. You know, the way Trelawney prophesied him being our equal. Then he would make his immortality ritual work. P.S. Don't forget that destroy all but a remnant of the other line. Requiring that level of intelligence was an additional burdensome detail. Prior odds of a random population member being that intelligent were low. But Lord Voldemort wasn't a randomly selected wizard. He was one particular wizard in the population who'd come to everyone's attention. The puzzle of the mark implied a certain minimum level of intelligence, even if, hypothetically, the Dark Lord had taken longer to think it through. Then again, in the Muggle world, all of the extremely intelligent people Harry knew about from history had not become evil dictators or terrorists. The closest thing to that in the Muggle world was hedge fund managers, and none of them had tried to take over so much as a third world country, a point which put upper bounds on both their possible evil and possible goodness. There were hypotheses where the Dark Lord was smart, and the Order of the Phoenix didn't just instantly die, but those hypotheses were more complicated and ought to get complexity penalties. After the complexity penalties of the further excuses were factored in, there would be a large likelihood ratio from the hypotheses the Dark Lord is smart versus the Dark Lord was stupid to the observation. The Dark Lord did not instantly win the war. That was probably worth a 10-1 likelihood ratio in favor of the Dark Lord being stupid, but maybe not 100-1. Couldn't actually say that the Dark Lord instantly wins had a probability of more than 99%. Assuming the Dark Lord started out smart, the sum over all possible excuses would be more than 1. And then there was the prophecy, which might or might not have originally included a line about how Lord Voldemort would immediately die if he confronted the Potters, which Albus Dumbledore had then edited in Professor McGonagall's memory in order to lure Lord Voldemort to his doom. If there was no such line, the prophecy did sound somewhat more like you-know-who and the boy who lived were destined to have some later confrontation. But in that case, it was less likely that Dumbledore would have come up with a plausible-sounding excuse not to take Harry to the Hall of Prophecy. Harry was wondering if he could even get a Bayesian calculation out of this. Of course, the point of a subjective Bayesian calculation wasn't that, after you made up a bunch of numbers, multiplying them out would give you an exactly right answer. The real point was that the process of making up numbers would force you to tally all the relevant facts and weigh all the relative probabilities. Like realizing, as soon as you actually thought about the probability of the dark mark not fading if you-know-who was dead, that the probability wasn't low enough for the observation to count as strong evidence. One version of the process was to tally hypotheses and list out evidence, make up all the numbers, do the calculation, and then throw out the final answer and go with your brain's gut feeling after you'd forced it to really weigh everything. The trouble was that the items of evidence weren't conditionally independent, and there were multiple interacting background facts of interest. Well, one thing at least was certain. If the calculation could be done at all, it was going to take a piece of paper and a pencil. In the fireplace at one side of the headmaster's office, the flames suddenly flared up, turning from orange to bright bilious green. "Ah," said Professor McGonagall into the uncomfortable non-silence. "That would be Mad-Eye Moody, I suppose. Let this matter bide for now," the headmaster said in some relief as he too turned to regard the flue. "I believe we are about to receive some news regarding it as well. Hypothesis: Hermione Granger, April 8, 1992, 6:53 p.m. Meanwhile, in the Great Hall of Hogwarts, as the students who didn't have secret meetings with the headmaster bustled about their dinner around 4 huge tables. "It's funny," Dean Thomas said thoughtfully. I didn't believe the general when he said that what we learned would change us forever, and we'd never be able to return to a normal life afterward. Once we knew, once we saw what he could see. I know, said Seamus Finnegan. I thought it was just a joke too, like, everything else General Chaos ever said ever. But now, Dean said sadly, we can't go back, can we? It'd be like going back to a muggle school after having been to Hogwarts. We've just got to stay around each other. That's all we can do, or we'll go crazy. Seamus Finnegan, next to him, just nodded wordlessly and ate another bite of Veldbeest. Around them, the conversation at the Gryffindor table continued. It wasn't as relentless as it had been yesterday, but now and then the topic wandered back. Well, there must have been some sort of love triangle, said a second-year witch named Samantha Crowley. She never answered when asked if there was any relation. The question is, which ways was it going before it all went wrong? Who was in love with who, and whether or not that person loved them back? I don't know how many possibilities there are. 64, said Sarah Variable, a blossoming beauty who probably should have been sorted into Ravenclaw or Hufflepuff instead. No, wait, that's wrong. I mean, if nobody loved Malfoy and Malfoy didn't love anyone, then he wouldn't really be part of the love triangle. This is going to take arithmancy. Could you all wait 2 minutes? I, for one, think it perfectly clear that Granger is Potter's Moirel, and that Potter was auspicing between Malfoy and Granger. The witch who'd spoken nodded with the self-satisfaction of someone who has just precisely nailed down a complicated issue. Those aren't even words, objected a young wizard. You're just making them up as you go. Sometimes you can't describe a thing using real words. It's so sad, said Sheris and Gasserin, who actually had tears in her eyes. They were just so obviously meant to be together. You mean Potter and Malfoy, said a second-year named Colleen Johnson. I know, their families hated each other so much, there's no way they couldn't fall in love. No, I mean all three of them, said Sheris. This produced a brief pause in the huddled conversation. Dean Thomas was quietly choking on his lemonade, trying not to make any sounds as it trickled out of his mouth and soaked into his shirt. Wow, said a dark-haired witch by the name of Nancy Hewer. That's really sophisticated of you, Sheris. Look, you all, we need to keep this realistic, said Alois Rosen, a tall witch who'd been general of an army and hence spoke with an air of authority. We know, because she kissed him, that Granger was in love with Potter. So the only reason she'd try to kill Malfoy is if she knew that she was losing Potter to him. There's no need to make it all sound so complicated. You're all acting like this is a play instead of real life. But even if Granger was in love, it's still funny that she just snapped like that, said Chloe, whose black robes combined with her night-black skin to make her look like a darkened silhouette. I don't know. I think maybe there's more to this than just a romance novel gone wrong. I think maybe most people haven't got any idea at all what's going on. Yes, thank you, burst out Dean Thomas. Look, don't you realize, like Harry Potter told us all, if you didn't predict that something would happen, if it took you completely by surprise, then what you believed about the world when you didn't see it coming isn't enough to explain. Dean's voice trailed off as he saw that nobody was listening. It's completely hopeless, isn't it? You hadn't figured that out yet, said Lavender Brown, who was sitting across the table from her two fellow former chaotics. How'd you ever make lieutenant? Oh, you two be quiet. Sheris snapped at them. It's obvious you both want the three of them for yourselves. I mean it, Chloe said. What if what's really going on is different from all the, normal things that all the ordinary people are talking about? What if somebody made Granger do what she did, just like Potter was trying to tell everyone? I think Chloe's right, said a foreign-looking boy wizard who always introduced himself as Adrian Turnipseed, though his parents had actually named him Mad Drongo. I think this whole time there's been. Adrian lowered his voice ominously. A hidden hand. Adrian raised his voice again, shaping all that's happened. One person who's been behind everything from the beginning, and I don't mean Professor Snape either. You don't mean, gasped Sarah. Yes, Adrian said. The real one behind it all is Tracy Davis. That's what I think too, Chloe said. After all, she glanced around rapidly. Ever since that thing with the bullies and the ceiling, even the trees in the forests around Hogwarts look like they're shaking, like they're afraid. Seamus Finnegan was frowning thoughtfully. I think I see where Harry gets his. From, Seamus said, lowering his voice so that only Lavender and Dean could hear. Oh, I totally know what you mean, Lavender said. She didn't bother to lower her own voice. It's a wonder he didn't crack and just start killing everyone ages ago. Personally, Dean said, also in a quieter voice, I'd say the really scary part is that could have been us. Yeah, said Lavender. It's a good thing we're all perfectly sane now. Dean and Seamus nodded solemnly. Hypothesis. GL, April 8th, 1992, 8:08 p.m. The flue fire of the headmaster's office blazed a bright pale green, the fire concentrating in on itself into a spinning emeraldine whirlwind, and then flared even brighter and spit a human figure into the air. There was a blur of motion as the resolving figure snapped up a wand, smoothly spinning with the flue's momentum like a ballet dance step, so that his firing arc covered the entire 360-degree arc of the room. And then just as abruptly, the figure stopped in place. In the first instant that Harry saw that man, before Harry even took in the eye, he noticed the scars on the hands, the scars on the face, like the man had been burned and cut over his entire body, though only the man's hands and face were visible, of all his flesh. The rest of the man's body was hidden, encased not in robes, but in leather that looked more like armor than clothing, dark grey leather, matching the man's mess of greyed hair. The next thing that Harry's vision comprehended was the brilliant blue eye occupying the right side of the man's face. One part of Harry's mind realized that the person whom Professor McGonagall had named Mad-Eye Moody was the same as the one Dumbledore had called Alastor. Within the memory Dumbledore had shown Harry, an image from before whatever event had scarred every inch of the man's body and taken a chunk out of his nose, and another part of his mind noticed the jolt of adrenaline. Harry had drawn his wand in sheer reflex when the man had spun out of the flue like that. There had been something about it that felt like ambush. Harry's hand had already started to level his wand for a somnium before he'd managed to stop himself. Even now, the armored man was holding his wand level, not pointed at any particular person, but covering the whole room, and that wand was already in perfect line with his eyes, like a soldier sighting down a gun. There was danger in the man's stance and the set of his boots, danger in the leather armor he wore, and danger in that brilliant blue eye. When the scarred man spoke, addressing the headmaster, his voice was edged. I suppose you think this room is secure. There are only friends here, Dumbledore said. The man's head jerked toward Harry. That include him. If Harry Potter is not our friend, Dumbledore said gravely, then we are all certainly doomed, so we may as well assume that he is. The man's wand stayed level, not quite pointing at Harry. Boy almost drew on me just then. Harry said. He noticed that his hand was still tightly holding the wand and consciously relaxed his hand and dropped it back to his side. Sorry about that, you looked a bit combat ready. The scarred man's wand moved slightly away from where it had almost pointed at Harry, though it didn't lower, and the man let out a short bark of laughter. Constant vigilance, eh, lad, said the man. It's not paranoia if they really are out to get you, Harry recited the proverb. The man turned fully toward Harry, and insofar as Harry could read any expression on the scarred face, the man now looked interested. Dumbledore's eyes had regained some of the brilliant twinkle that they'd had before the Azkaban breakout, a smile beneath his silver mustache, as though that smile had never left. Harry, this is Alastor Moody, called also Mad-Eye, who will command the Order of the Phoenix after me, if anything should happen to me, that is. Alastor, this is Harry Potter. I have every hope the two of you shall get along fantastically. I've heard a good deal about you, boy, said Mad-Eye Moody. His one dark natural eye stayed fixed on Harry, while the point of brilliant blue spun frantically, seeming to rotate all the way around within its socket. Not all of it good. Heard they're calling you the Dementor Spooker in the department. After some consideration, Harry decided to reply with a knowing smile. How'd you pull off that one, boy? The man said softly. Now his blue eye was fixed on Harry as well. I had a little chat with one of the Aurors who escorted the Dementor there from Azkaban. Bate Martin said it came straight from the pit, and no one gave it any special instructions along the way. Of course, she could be lying. There wasn't any sneaky trick to that one, Harry said. I just did it the hard way. Of course, I could also be lying. Dumbledore was leaning back in his chair, chuckling in the background, like he was just another device in the headmaster's office, and that was the sound he made. The scarred man turned back to face the headmaster, though his wand stayed pointed low and in Harry's general direction. When he spoke, his voice was gruff and businesslike. I have a lead on a recent host of Valdes. You're certain his shade is in Hogwarts now? Not certain, Dumbledore began. Say what? Harry interrupted. After having nearly concluded that the Dark Lord didn't exist, it was a shock to hear it being discussed that matter-of-factly. Valdes' host, Moody said shortly. The one he possessed before he took over Granger. If the tales speak true, Dumbledore said, there is some device of power which binds Voldemort's shade to this world. And by that means, he may bargain with a host for possession of their body, conferring on them some portion of his power and his pride. So the obvious question is who's gained too much power too quickly, Moody said abruptly. And it turns out that there's a fellow who's gone and banished the Band and Banshee, staked an entire rogue vampire clan in Asia, tracked down the Wagga Wagga werewolf, and exterminated a pack of ghouls using a tea strainer. And he's milking it for all it's worth. There's been talk of the Order of Merlin. Seems to have turned into a charmer and a politician, not just a powerful wizard. Dear me, murmured Dumbledore. Are you certain that he is not relying on his own skills? Checked his grades, Moody said. Record shows Gilderoy Lockhart received a troll in his defense, OWLS. Didn't bother with the NEWT, just the sort of sucker to take the deal Valdi was offering. The blue eye whirled crazily within its socket. Unless you remember Lockhart as a student and think he had enough potential to do all that by himself. No, said Professor McGonagall. She frowned. Not a chance, I should say. I fear I must agree, Dumbledore said with an undertone of pain. Ah, Gilderoy, you poor fool. Moody's grin was more like a snarl. 3 in the morning work for you, Albus. Lockhart should be at his home tonight. Harry listened to this with increasing alarm, wondering if even the ministry had any rules about magistrates needing to issue warrants, never mind the illegal vigilante organization Harry now seemed to have joined. Excuse me, Harry said. What exactly happens at 3 in the morning? There must have been something in Harry's voice that gave him away, because the scarred man whirled on him. You have a problem with that boy. Harry paused, trying to figure out how to phrase this to the stranger. You want to take him down yourself, pressed the scarred man. Get revenge for your parents, eh? No, Harry said as politely he could. Honestly, look, if we knew for certain he was a willing host for who that's one thing, but if we're not sure and you're heading off to kill him, kill. Mad-Eye Moody snorted. It's what's locked up in his head, Moody tapped his forehead, that we need from him, boy. If we're lucky, Valdi can't wipe the sucker's memories as easy as in his living days, and Lockhart will remember what the Horcrux looked like. Harry mentally noted down the word Horcrux for future research and said, I'm just worried that someone innocent, what sounds like a pretty decent person, if he did do all that himself, might be about to get hurt. Auras hurt people, the scarred man said shortly. Bad people if you're lucky. Some days you won't be lucky, and that's all there is to it. Just remember, dark wizards hurt a lot more people than we do. Harry took a deep breath. Can you at least try not to hurt this person, in case he's not? What is a first year doing in this room, Albus? Demanded the scarred man, now whirling to face the headmaster. And don't tell me it's for what he did when he was a baby. Harry Potter is not an ordinary first year, the headmaster said quietly. He has already accomplished feats impossible enough to shock even me, Alistair. His is the only intellect in the Order which might someday match that of Voldemort himself, as you or I never could. The scarred man leaned over the headmaster's desk. He's a liability, naive, doesn't know a bloody thing about what war's like. I want him out of here, and all his memories of the Order wiped before one of Valdi's servants plucks them straight out of his mind. I'm an Occlumens, actually. Mad-Eye Moody directed a narrow look at the headmaster, who nodded, and then the scarred man turned to face Harry, their gazes meeting. The sudden fury of the Legilimency attack almost made Harry fall off his chair, as a blade of white-hot steel cut into the imaginary person at the forefront of his mind. Harry hadn't had a chance to practice since Mr. Bestir's training, and Harry very nearly lost his grip on the imaginary person. The back of his mind was pretending to be, as that person's world turned into searing lava and a furious probe of questions. Harry almost lost his grip on only pretending to hallucinate, only pretending to be the imaginary person that was screaming in shock and pain as the Legilimency tore apart his sanity and reshaped him to believe that he was on fire. Harry managed to break eye contact, dropping his eyes to Moody's chin. You're out of practice, boy, Moody said. Harry wasn't looking at the man's face, but his voice was deadly grim. And I'll warn you of this but once. Valdi isn't like any other Legilimens in recorded history. He doesn't need to look you in the eyes, and if your shields are that rusty he'd creep in so softly you'd never notice a thing. Duly noted, Harry said to the scarred chin. Harry was more shaken than he'd have admitted. Mr. Bestir hadn't been anywhere near that powerful and had never tested Harry like that. Pretending to be someone hurting that much had. Harry couldn't find words for describing what it felt like to contain an imaginary person in that much pain, but it hadn't been normal. Do I get any credit for being an Occlumens in the first place? So you think you're all grown up already, eh? Look me in the eyes. Harry strengthened his shields and looked once more into the dark grey eye and the brilliant blue. Ever watched someone die? Asked Mad-Eye Moody. My parents, Harry said evenly. I recovered the memory in January when I went in front of a Dementor to learn the Patronus charm. I remember you know whose voice. A chill went through Harry's body, his wand twitching in his hand. My main tactical report is that you know who could speak the killing curse in less than half a second, but you probably already knew that. There was a gasp from Professor McGonagall's direction, and Severus's face had tightened. All right, Mad-Eye Moody said softly. A strange, thin grin twisted up the lips within the scarred face. I'll make you the same offer I'd make to any trainee aura. Land one touch on me, boy, one hit, one spell, and I'll concede your right to talk back to me. Alastair, exclaimed Professor McGonagall's voice. Surely that's an unreasonable test. Mr. Potter, whatever his other merits, does not have 100 years of fighting experience. Harry's eyes made a lightning dart around the room, passing over the peculiar devices, glancing past Dumbledore and Severus, and the sorting hat, settling briefly here and there. Harry couldn't see Professor McGonagall from where he was, but that didn't matter. There was only one device he'd really wanted to look at, and the point of all the other glances had just been to conceal which one. All righty, Harry said, and hopped off his chair, ignoring Professor McGonagall's inhalation and the potion's master's snort of disbelief. Dumbledore's eyebrows had lifted, and Moody was grinning like a tiger. Be sure to wake me up in 40 minutes if he does get me. Harry settled into a duelist starting stance, his wand held low. Let's go, then. Harry opened his eyes, his head feeling like it had been stuffed with cotton wool. Everyone else was gone from the headmaster's office. The flue fire dimmed. Only Dumbledore still waited behind the desk. Hello, Harry, the headmaster said quietly. I didn't even see him move, Harry marveled, muscles creaking as he sat up. You were standing 2 paces away from Alastair Moody, said Dumbledore, and you took your eye off his wand. Harry nodded as he took the cloak of invisibility out of his pouch. I mean, I was taking the dueling stance so that he'd think I was a standard idiot and underestimate me, but I have to admit that was impressive. So you planned it all along, Harry, Dumbledore said. Of course, Harry said. Note how I'm doing this as soon as I wake up, rather than pausing to think of it. Harry drew the hood of the cloak over his head and glanced back up at the wall clock he'd surreptitiously glanced at earlier. It had then shown around 23 minutes after 8, and now it was 5 minutes after 9. Minerva stared as the boy put himself into the dueling stance, his wand held low. For a second Minerva wondered if Harry might possibly know. That was completely ridiculous. It was Mad-Eye Moody, and that was beyond impossible. Of course, that was what she'd thought about his partial transfiguration, too. Let's go, then, Harry said and fell over. Severus gave a single chuckle. Mr. Potter has his points, I must confess, the potion's master said, though I would never say it while he was awake, and if you repeat the words I shall deny them, for the boy's ego is quite large enough already. Mr. Potter does have his points, Mad-Eye, but dueling is not among them. Mad-Eye's own chuckle was lower and grimmer. Oh, yes, said Mad-Eye. Only fools duel. Standing like that and waiting for me to attack, what was the boy thinking? Why, I ought to give him a scar to remember this occasion. Alastair, barked Albus, just as she cried, stop. Severus dashed forward, and Mad-Eye Moody deliberately leveled his wand on Harry Potter's body. Stupefy. Mad-Eye's body seemed to almost flicker as he spun on his wooden foot like lightning, faster than she'd ever seen anyone move without magic, the red stunning hex passing through the suddenly empty air and barely missing Severus to crash into the opposite wall. And by the time her eyes jerked back to Moody, There were 17 radiant orbs in the pattern of a Sagitta Magica, visible for only an instant before they streaked brilliance and struck something that fell to the floor with a thud. "Hello again, Harry," said Dumbledore. "I cannot believe that guy's reaction time," Harry said, brushing off his cloak as he stood up from where he'd been lying invisible on the floor, unseen by his previous self. "I can't believe his movement speed either. I'm going to have to figure out some way to zap him without speaking an incantation that gives it away." And then Mad-Eye ducked hard and fast, his hands hitting flat on the floor. She almost didn't see the two tiny white threads passing through the space he'd been, but her eyes went to the blue spark when the threads impacted on one of the headmaster's devices, and by the time she managed to turn her eyes back, Mad-Eye had spun smoothly up to his feet. His wand was dancing unseeably fast, and there was another thudding sound. "Hello again, Harry." "Pardon me, headmaster, but could you let me go down your stairs, and then come back up again, before I make the final jump backward?" "This is going to take longer than 1 hour of preparation." Minerva gaped at Mad-Eye Moody, who hadn't lowered his wand in the slightest, and Severus had a look on his face that was almost like shock. "Well, boy," said Mad-Eye Moody, "what else have you got?" Harry Potter's head appeared, floating in midair as an invisible hand drew back the hood of his invisibility cloak. "That eye," said Harry Potter. There was a strange, fierce light in the boy's eyes. "That isn't any ordinary device. It can see right through my invisibility cloak. You dodged my transfigured taser as soon as I started raising it, even though I didn't speak any incantations. And now that I've watched it again, you spotted all my time-turned selves the moment you flew into this room, didn't you?" Mad-Eye Moody was smiling, the same teeth-bared grin she'd seen him wear as they'd faced off against Voldemort himself. "Spend 100 years hunting dark wizards, and you see everything," said Moody. "I once arrested a young Japanese who tried a similar trick. He found out the hard way that his shadow replica technique was no match for this eye of mine. You see in all directions," Harry Potter said, that strange, fierce light still in his gaze. "No matter where that eye is pointing, it sees everything around you." Moody's tiger grin grew wider. "There's no more of you in this room now," Mad-Eye said. "Think that's because you'll give up after this time, or because you'll win? Any bets, boy?" "It's my final attempt, because I decided to stake my last 3 hours on one shot," said Harry Potter. As for whether I win, there was a blur filling the whole air of the headmaster's office. Mad-Eye Moody leapt to one side with blinding speed, and an instant later Harry's head darted backward as he cried, "Stupefy!" 3 shimmers in the air went past Harry's moving head, just as a red bolt erupted from Harry's location, shooting past Moody as he dodged in yet another direction. If she'd blinked, she would have missed it, the red bolt making an angled turn in midair and slamming into Moody's ear. Moody fell. Harry Potter's floating head dropped to the height of a first-year on their hands and knees, then dropped further to the ground, his face showing sudden exhaustion. Minerva McGonagall said, "What in Merlin's name just, so you went to Flitwick then?" Moody said. The retired Auror was now sitting in a chair, drinking long draughts from a restorative in a bottle he'd taken off his belt. Harry Potter nodded, now sitting in his own chair instead of perched on an armrest. "I tried the defense professor first, but the boy grimaced. He wasn't available. Well, I decided it was worth risking 5 house points, and if you say a risk is worth it, you can't complain when you have to pay up. Anyway, I figured that if you had an eye that saw things other people couldn't see, then as Isaac Asimov pointed out in Second Foundation, the weapon to use is a brilliant light. Read enough science fiction, you know, and you'll read everything at least once. Anyway, I told Professor Flitwick that I needed a charm that would make a huge number of shapes, bright and flickering and filling the whole office, but invisible, so only your eye could see them. I had no idea what it would even mean to cast an illusion and then make it invisible, but I figured if I didn't mention that out loud, Professor Flitwick would just do it anyway, and he did. Turns out there was no spell like that I could cast myself, but Flitwick charmed me a one-time device for it, though I had to persuade him that it wasn't cheating, since nothing could possibly be cheating against an aura who'd lived long enough to retire. And then I still didn't see how I could hit you when you were moving that fast. So I asked about targeted spells, and that was when Flitwick showed me that hex eye cast at the end, the swerving stunner. It's one of Professor Flitwick's own inventions. He's a champion duelist as well as a charms master. I know that, son. Sorry. Anyway, the professor says he left the dueling circuit before he got a chance to use that spell, since it only works as a finishing move on an unshielded opponent. The hex gets as close to the target as possible along its original trajectory, and then once it detects that the target is getting more distant again, the hex turns in midair and heads straight for the target. It can only swerve once, but the incantation sounds very close to stupefy, and the hex is the same red color. So if the enemy thinks it's a regular stunning hex and tries a normal dodge, that midair retargeting will finish them off. Oh, and the professor requested that none of us talk about his special move, just in case he does get a chance to use it during competition someday. But, said Professor McGonagall. She glanced at Mad-Eye Moody, who was nodding his approval, and at Severus, who was keeping his face decidedly blank. Mr. Potter, you just stunned Mad-Eye Moody, the most famous dark wizard hunter in the history of the Auror Office. That should have been impossible. Moody let out a dark chuckle. What's your answer to that one, kid? I'm curious. Well, Harry said. First of all, Professor McGonagall, neither of us were fighting seriously. Neither of you. Of course, Harry said. In a serious fight, Mr. Moody would have dropped all my copies immediately without waiting for them to attack. And on my side, if it was actually necessary to take down the most famous Auror in the history of the office, I'd get Headmaster Dumbledore to do it for me. And beyond that. Since that wasn't a real fight, Harry paused. How can I put this? Wizards are used to duels where people fight back and forth with spells for a while. But if two muggles with guns stand in a small room and fire bullets at each other, then whoever hits first wins. And if one of them is deliberately missing his shots, giving the other person one chance after another, like Mr. Moody gave me one chance after another, well, you'd have to be pretty pathetic to lose. Oh, not that pathetic, Moody said, with a slightly threatening grin. Harry didn't seem to notice. You might say that Mr. Moody was testing me to see if I would try to fight him or try to win. That is, whether I'd carry out the role of somebody fighting, use standard spells I already knew, even though I didn't expect the consequences of that action to be victory, or if I'd search through unusual plans until I found something that could win. Like the difference between a student who sits in class, because that's what students do, versus a student who cares enough to ask themselves what it takes to actually learn a piece of material, and practices however necessary. You see, Professor McGonagall. When you look at it that way, realize that Mr. Moody was giving me chances, and that I shouldn't attack in the first place unless I think I can win. Then I don't come out looking so well, since it actually took me 3 tries to get him. Plus, like I said, in a real fight Mr. Moody could have turned himself invisible or put up shields. Don't go relying too much on shields, boy, Mad-Eye said. The leather-clad Auror took another sip from his restorative flask. What you learn in your first year at the academy doesn't stay true forever, not against the strongest dark wizards. Every shield ever made, there's some curse that goes straight through it, if you're not quick enough to cast the counter. And there's one curse that goes through everything, and it's a curse any Death Eater will use. Harry Potter nodded gravely. Right, some spells are impossible to block. I'll remember that in case anyone casts the killing curse at me. Again, that kind of cleverness gets people killed, boy, and don't you forget it. A sad-sounding sigh from the boy who lived. I know, sorry. So, son, you had something to say about when Albus and I go after Lockhart. Harry opened his mouth, then paused. I won't tell you how to run a war, the boy who lived said eventually. I don't have any experience at that. All I know is that there are consequences. Please be advised that my own assessment is that Lockhart is probably innocent, so if you can avoid hurting him without too much risk, the boy shrugged. I don't know the cost. Just please, if you can, be careful not to hurt him if he's innocent. If I can, said Moody. And you're aiming to look through his mind for evidence about the Dark Lord, aren't you? I don't know what the rules are in magical Britain about admissible evidence, but everyone's always guilty of breaking some law or another. There's just too many laws. So if it's not about the Dark Lord, don't turn him into the ministry. Just obfuscate him and go, okay? Moody frowned. Son, nobody gains power that fast without being up to something. Then leave it for the ordinary Aurors, if and when they find evidence the ordinary way. Please, Mr. Moody. Call it a quirk of my muggle upbringing, but if it's not about the war, I don't want us to be the evil police who break into people's houses in the middle of the night, rummage through their minds and send them off to Azkaban. I don't see the sense of it, son, but I suppose I could do you the favour. Is there aught else, Alistair? Inquired Albus. Yes, said Moody. About that defence professor of yours, hypothesis. Gilderoy Lockhart. End hypothesis. Dumbledore, April 9th, 1992, 5:32 p.m. As Professor Quirrell slowly raised up his tea, the teacup jerked in midair, sending the dark, translucent liquid just barely slopping over the side, so that only 3 single drops crawled down the side of the teacup. Harry would have missed it if he hadn't happened to be watching closely, for Professor Quirrell's hand was perfectly steady on the cup before and after. If that small, jerky motion advanced to a constant tremor, it would be the end of any non-wandless magic for the defense professor. Wandwork had no room for trembling fingers. How much that would actually handicap Professor Quirrell, if at all, Harry couldn't guess. The defense professor was certainly capable of wandless magic, yet still tended to use a wand for larger things, but for him that might only be a convenience. Insanity, said Professor Quirrell, as he carefully sipped from his tea. He was looking at the teacup, not at Harry, which was unusual for him, can be a signature all its own. The defense professor's small office was silent, the sound-warded room quiet in a way the headmaster's office never could be. Sometimes the two of them both happened to finish exhaling or inhaling at the same time, and then there was an auditory emptiness that was almost a sound in itself. I'll agree with that in one sense, Harry said. If somebody tells me that everyone is staring at them and that their underwear is being dusted with thought-controlling powder, I know they're psychotic, because that's the standard signature of psychosis. But if you tell me that anything confusing points to Albus Dumbledore as a suspect, that seems overreaching. Just because I can't see a purpose doesn't mean there is no purpose. Purposeless, said Professor Quirrell. Oh, but the madness of Dumbledore is not that he is purposeless, but that he has too many purposes. The headmaster might have planned this to make Lucius Malfoy throw away his game for vengeance on you, or it might be a dozen other plots. Who knows what the headmaster thinks he has reason to do when he has found reason to do so many strange things already. Harry had politely declined tea, even knowing that Professor Quirrell would know what it meant. He'd considered bringing his own can of soda, but had decided against that as well, after realizing how easy it would be for the defense professor to teleport in a bit of potion, even if the two of them couldn't touch each other with direct magic. I have seen a little now of Dumbledore, Harry said. Unless everything I have seen is a lie, I find it difficult to believe that he would plot to send any Hogwarts student to Azkaban, ever. Ah, the defense professor said softly, the tiny reflection of the teacup gleaming in his pale eyes. But perhaps that is another signature, Mr. Potter. You have not yet comprehended the perspective of a man like Dumbledore. If he must, in some sufficiently noble cause, sacrifice a student, why, who would he choose but she who declared herself a heroine? That gave Harry some pause. It might just be hindsight bias, but that did seem to concentrate some of that hypothesis' probability mass onto framing Hermione in particular. Similarly, Professor Quirrell had predicted in advance that Dumbledore might target Draco. But if it's you behind all of this, Professor, you might have shaped your plans to frame the headmaster and taken care to cast suspicion on him in advance. The concept of evidence had something of a different meaning when you were dealing with someone who had declared themselves to play the game at one level higher than you. I see your point, Professor, Harry said evenly, giving no hint of his other thoughts. So you think it most probable that it was the headmaster who framed Hermione? Not necessarily, Mr. Potter. Professor Quirrell drained his teacup in one swallow and then set it down, the cup making a sharp rap as it descended. There is also Severus Snape, though what he might think to gain from this I could not guess. Thus he is not my prime suspect either. Then who is? Harry said, somewhat puzzled. Professor Quirrell surely wasn't about to reply, you know who. The auras have a rule, said Professor Quirrell. Investigate the victim. Many would-be criminals imagine that if they are the apparent victims of a crime, they shall not be suspected. So many criminals imagine it, indeed, that every senior aura has seen it a dozen times over. You're not seriously trying to convince me that Hermione, the defense professor was giving Harry one of those slit-eyed looks that meant he was being stupid. Draco had been interrogated under Veritasrum, but Lucius might have had enough control to subvert auras to. "Oh, you think Lucius Malfoy set up his own son?" Harry said. "Why not?" Professor Quirrell said softly. "From Mr. Malfoy's recorded testimony, Mr. Potter, I gather that you enjoyed some success in changing Mr. Malfoy's political views. If Lucius Malfoy learned of that earlier, he might have decided that his former heir had become a liability." "I don't buy it," Harry said flatly. "You are being wantonly naive, Mr. Potter. The history books are full of family disputes turned murderous, for inconveniences and threats far less than those which Mr. Malfoy posed to his father. I suppose next you will tell me that Lord Malfoy of the Death Eaters is far too gentle to wish his son such harm." A tinge of heavy sarcasm. "Well, yes, frankly," Harry said. "Love is real, Professor, a phenomenon with observable effects. Brains are real, emotions are real, and love is as much a part of the real world as apples and trees. If you made experimental predictions without taking parental love into account, you'd have a heck of a time explaining why my own parents didn't abandon me at an orphanage after the incident with the science project." The defense professor did not react to this at all. Harry continued. "From what Draco says, Lucius prioritized him over important Wisengamot votes. That's significant evidence, since there's less expensive ways to fake love if you just want to fake it. And it's not like the prior probability of a parent loving their child is low. I suppose it's possible that Lucius was just taking on the role of a loving father, and he renounced that role after he learned Draco was consorting with Muggle-borns. But as the saying goes, Professor, one must distinguish possibility from probability." "All the better the crime," the defense professor said, still in that soft tone, "if no one would believe it of him. And how would Lucius even memory charm Hermione in the first place without setting off the wards? He's not a professor." "Oh, right. You think it's Professor Snape." "Wrong," said the defense professor. "Lucius Malfoy would trust no servant with that mission. But suppose some Hogwarts professor, intelligent enough to cast a well-formed memory charm, but of no great fighting ability, is visiting Hogsmeade. From a dark alley, the black-clad form of Malfoy steps forth. He would go in person for this, and speaks to her a single word. Imperio, legilimens rather," said Professor Quirrell. "I do not know if the Hogwarts wards would trigger for a returning professor under the Imperious curse. And if I do not know, Malfoy probably does not know either. But Malfoy is a perfect occlumens at least. He might be able to use legilimency. And for the target, perhaps Aurora Sinistra, none would question the astronomy professor moving about at night. Or even more obviously, Professor Sprout," said Harry, "since she's the last person anyone would suspect." The defense professor hesitated minutely. "Perhaps. Actually," Harry said then, putting a thoughtful frown on his face, "I don't suppose you know offhand if any of the current professors at Hogwarts were around back when Mr. Hagrid got framed in 1943. Dumbledore taught transfiguration, Kettleburn taught magical creatures, and Vector taught arithmancy," Professor Quirrell said at once. "And I believe that Bathsheba Babbling, now of ancient runes, was then a Ravenclaw prefect. But, Mr. Potter, there is no reason to suppose that anyone besides you-know-who was involved in that affair." Harry shrugged artfully. "Seemed worth asking the question, just to check. Anyway, Professor, I agree it's possible that some outsider legilimized a member of Hogwarts staff, and then obliviated them afterward. There's no way anyone would forget that part. But I don't think Lucius Malfoy is a probable candidate for the mastermind. It's possible, but not probable, that all of Lucius's apparent love for Draco was just a sense of duty, and that it all went up in a puff of smoke. It's possible, though not probable, that everything Lucius did in front of the Wisengamot was just an act. People's outsides do not always resemble their insides, like you said. But there's one piece of evidence that doesn't fit at all. And that would be," said the defense professor, his eyes half-lidded, "Lucius tried to reject 100,000 galleons for Hermione's life. I saw how surprised the Wisengamot was when Lucius said he was refusing it despite the rules of honor. The Wisengamot didn't expect that of him. Why wouldn't he just take the money while acting all indignant and pretending to grit his teeth? He wouldn't actually care that much about throwing Hermione into Azkaban. There was a pause. Perhaps the role he was playing ran away with him, said Professor Quirrell. It does happen, Mr. Potter, in the heat of the moment. Perhaps, Harry said. But it's still one more improbability to be postulated, and by the time you have to add up that many excuses in a theory, it can't be at the top of the list anymore. Anything else in particular you think I ought to think about, within the range of all other possibilities? There was a long silence. The defense professor's eyes dropped down to look at the empty teacup before them, seeming unusually distant. I suppose I can think of one final suspect, the defense professor said at last. Harry nodded. The defense professor didn't seem to notice, but only spoke on. Has the headmaster has told you anything, even a hint about Professor Trelawney's prophecy? Ha! Harry said automatically, converting his own sudden shock into the best dissembling he could manage. It probably was at the wrong level to fool Professor Quirrell, but Harry certainly couldn't take time to think before replying, wait. But how on earth would Professor Quirrell know about that? Professor Trelawney made a prophecy. You were there to hear its beginning, Professor Quirrell said, frowning. You called out to the entire school that the prophecy could not be about you, since you were not coming here, you were already here. He is coming, the one who will tear apart the very, and that was as far as Professor Trelawney had gotten before Dumbledore had grabbed her and vanished. Oh, that prophecy, Harry said. Sorry, it went clear out of my mind. Harry thought he put too much force into the end statement, and was 80% expecting Professor Quirrell to say, Aha, now Mr. Potter, what is this mysterious other prophecy you went to such lengths to deny? That is foolish, the defense professor said sharply, if indeed you are telling me the truth. Prophecies are not trivial things. I have racked my brain much over the little that I heard, but such a small fragment is simply too little. You think the one who's coming is the one who might have framed Hermione, said Harry, as his mind allocated yet another hypothesis, uncertain predicate referent, he who is coming. With no offense meant to Miss Granger, the defense professor said with another frown, her life or death does not seem that important. But someone was to come, one who, in your interpretation, was not already there, and someone so significant and unknown as a player. Who knows what else they may have done? Harry nodded and mentally sighed, because he was going to have to redo his Lord Voldemort odds calculation with yet another piece of evidence in the mix. Professor Quirrell spoke with eyes half-lidded, looking out like through slits. More than the question of whom the prophecy spoke, who was meant to hear it, it is said that fates are spoken to those with the power to cause them or avert them. Dumbledore, myself, you, as a distant fourth, Severus Snape. But of those four, Dumbledore and Snape would often be in Trelawney's presence. You and I are the ones who would not have spent much time around her before that Sunday. I think it quite likely that the prophecy was meant for one of us before Dumbledore took the prophetess away. Did the headmaster say nothing more to you? Professor Quirrell's voice was demanding now. I thought I heard too much force in that denial, Mr. Potter. Honestly, no, Harry said. It had honestly slipped clear out of my mind. Then I am rather put out with him, Professor Quirrell said softly. In fact, I think that I am angry. Harry said nothing. He didn't even sweat. It might have been a poor reason for confidence, but on this particular score, Harry did happen to be innocent. Professor Quirrell nodded once sharply, as though in acknowledgement. If there is nothing more to say between us, Mr. Potter, you may go. I can think of one other suspect, Harry said. Someone you didn't put on your list at all. Would you analyze him to me, Professor? There was another of those moments of silence that was almost a sound in itself. As for that suspect, the defense professor said softly, I think you shall prosecute him on your own, Mr. Potter, without help from me. I have heard such requests before, and experience leads me to refuse. Either I will do too good a job of prosecuting myself and convince you that I am guilty, or else you will decide that my prosecution was too half-hearted and that I am guilty. I will remark only this in my defense, that I would have needed a very good reason indeed to jeopardize your fragile alliance with the heir to House Malfoy. Hypothesis. The Defense Professor, April 8th, 1992, 8:37 p.m. So I fear I must take my leave, Dumbledore was saying gravely. I promised Quirinus, that is to say, I promised the Defense Professor, that I would not make any attempt to uncover his true identity in my own person or any other. And why'd you make a fool promise like that, then? Snapped Mad-Eye Moody. It was an unalterable condition of his employment, or so he said. Dumbledore glanced at Professor McGonagall, a wry smile briefly flitting over his face. And Minerva made it clear to me that Hogwarts required a competent defense professor this year, even if I had to haul Grindelwald out of Nurmengard and prevail on old affections to persuade him to take the position. I did not quite phrase it in that fashion. Your expression said it for you, my dear. And so soon the four of them, Harry, Professor McGonagall, the potions master, and Alistair Moody Acker, Mad-Eye, were ensconced all by themselves in the headmaster's office. It was strange how the headmaster's office seemed. Unbalanced, without the headmaster in it. If you didn't have the ancient wizened master to make it all seem solemn, you were just four people trying to have a serious meeting while surrounded by bizarre, noisy gadgets. Clearly visible from where Harry had perched himself on his chair's arm was a truncated conical object, like a cone with its top snipped off, slowly spinning around a pulsating central light which it shaded but did not obscure. And each time the inner light pulsated, the assembly made a vroop 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 sound that sounded oddly distant, muffled like it was coming from behind four solid walls, even though the spinning conical section thingy was only a meter or two away. Vroop, vroop, vroop. And then there were the various still-breathing bodies of Harry Potter he'd stashed in one quiet corner, cleaning up a mess that was his own in more ways than one. Only one body wasn't inside a copy of the invisibility cloak, but then it merely took a small effort of concentration for Harry to perceive his other selves beneath the cloak of which he was master, an effort which Harry had carefully not put forth earlier to avoid getting advanced temporal information he wanted to determine by his own decision. The sad thing was that by this point, having his own body visibly lying in a corner didn't seem all that crazy. It was just Hogwarts. "All right, then," Moody said, looking rather sour about it. From within his leather armor, the scarred man took out a black folder. "This is a copy of what Amelia's people put together. She almost certainly knows we've got it, but it's all off the books, that clear. Anyway," and Moody told them who the Department of Magical Law Enforcement thought Quirrell really was. A seemingly ordinary Hogwarts student, though talented enough that he'd been only narrowly beaten out for the head boy position, who'd gone vacationing in Albania after his graduation, disappeared, returned after 25 years, and then been caught up in the Wizarding War. It was murdering the House of Monroe that made Valdi's name, Moody said. Until then, he was just another dark wizard with delusions of grandeur and Bellatrix Black. But after that, Moody snorted. Every fool in the country flocked to serve him. You would have hoped the Wisengamot would turn serious once they realized Valdi was willing to kill their own sacred selves. And that's just what the bastards did hope, that some other bastard would turn serious. None of the cowards wanted to step in front. It was Monroe, Crouch, Bones, and Longbottom. That was nearly everyone in the ministry who dare say a word that might give Valdi offense. "That was how your house came to be ennobled, Mr. Potter," injected the solemn voice of Professor McGonagall. "There is an ancient law that if anyone ends a most ancient house, whoever avenges that blood will be made noble. To be sure, the House of Potter was already older than some lines called ancient, but yours was titled a noble House of Britain after the end of the war, in recognition that you had avenged the most ancient House of Monroe." "Flush of gratitude and all that," Mad-Eye Moody said sourly. "It didn't last, but at least James and Lily got a fancy title and a useless medal to take to their graves. But that's leaving out 8 years of complete horror after Monroe disappeared and Regulus Black, he was Monroe's private source in the Death Eaters, we're pretty sure was executed by Valdi. Like a dam breaking and gore flooding out, drowning the whole country. Albus Bloody Dumbledore himself had to step into Monroe's shoes, and that was barely enough for us to survive." Harry listened with an odd sense of unreality. Some of it felt right, matched up with observation, especially with the speech Professor Quirrell had made before Christmas, and yet, this was Professor Quirrell they were talking about. "So that's who the department thinks is your defense professor," Mad-Eye Moody finished up his account. "Now what do you think, son?" "Well," Harry said slowly, "it is also possible to have a mask behind the mask. The obvious next thought is that this David Monroe person died in the war after all, and this is just someone else pretending to be David Monroe pretending to be Quirinus Quirrell." "That's obvious," said Professor McGonagall. "Dear Merlin." "Really, boy," said Mad-Eye Moody, his blue eye spinning rapidly. I'd say that's a little paranoid. You don't know Professor Quirrell, Harry did not say. It's an easy theory to test, Harry said out loud. Just check whether the defense professor remembers something about the war that the real David Monroe would have known. Though I suppose, if he's playing the part of David Monroe pretending to be someone else, he has a good excuse to pretend he's pretending he doesn't know what you're talking about. A little paranoid, said the scarred man, his voice rising. Not paranoid enough. Constant vigilance. Think about it, lad. What if the real David Monroe never came back from Albania? There was a pause. I see, Harry said. Of course you do, Professor McGonagall said. Don't mind me, please. I'll just sit here quietly going mad. In this line of work, if you survive, you learn that there's 3 kinds of dark wizards, Moody said grimly. His wand wasn't pointed at anyone. It was angled slightly downward, but it was in his hand. It had never left his hand since the moment he'd entered the room. There's dark wizards that have 1 name, there's dark wizards that have 2 names, and there's dark wizards that change names like you and I change clothes. I saw Monroe go through 3 Death Eaters like he was snapping twigs. There's not many wizards that good at age 45. Dumbledore, maybe, but not many others. Perhaps that is true, said the potion's master from where he was lurking. But what of it, Mad-Eye? Whatever his identity, Monroe was surely the Dark Lord's enemy. I've heard Death Eaters curse his name even after they thought him dead. They feared him well. So far as defense professors are concerned, Professor McGonagall said primly, I shall take it and be grateful. Moody swung around to glare at her. Just where the devil was, Monroe, all those years he was gone, eh? Maybe he thought he could make a name for himself in Britain by opposing Valdi and vanished away when he found out he was wrong. Then why'd he come back now, huh? What's his new plan? Harry ventured tentatively. He says he always wanted to be a great defense professor because all the best fighting wizards have taught at Hogwarts, and he kind of is being an incredibly good defense professor, actually. I mean, if he just wanted to keep up a disguise, he could get away with much sloppier work. Professor McGonagall was nodding firmly. Naive, Moody said flatly. I suppose you all haven't wondered if your defense professor set up the whole house of Monroe to be wiped out. What? Cried Professor McGonagall. A mystery wizard hears about a missing kid from a most ancient house of Britain, Moody said. Steps into the shoes of David Monroe, but stays away from the real Monroe family. But eventually, the house is bound to notice something wrong. So this impostor somehow prods Valdi into wiping them all out, maybe leaked a password they'd given him for their wards, and then he was a lord of the Wisengamot. There seemed to be a fight going on inside Harry's mind between Hufflepuff 1, who never trusted the defense professor in the first place, and Hufflepuff 2, who was far too loyal to Harry's friend, Professor Quirrell, to believe something like that just because Moody said so. It is kind of obvious, though, observed his Slytherin part. I mean, do you actually believe that under natural circumstances, anyone would end up as the last heir to a most ancient house, and Lord Voldemort killed his family, and he has to avenge his martial arts sensei? If anything, I'd say he went too far over the top in setting up his new identity as the ideal literary hero. That sort of thing doesn't happen in real life. This from an orphan who was raised unaware of his heritage, commented Harry's inner critic, with a prophecy about him. You know, I don't think we've ever read a story about 2 equally destined heroes competing to see who's cliched enough to take down the villain, yes, replied the central Harry over the distant vrooping noise in the background. It's a very sad life we lead, and you're not helping. There's only one thing to do at this point, said Ravenclaw. And we all know what it is, so why argue? But Harry replied, how do we test experimentally whether or not Professor Quirrell is the original David Monroe? I mean, what sort of observable behaves differently, depending on whether he's the real David Monroe or an imposter? What do you want me to do about it, Mad-Eye? Professor McGonagall was demanding. I can't, you can, the scarred man said, glaring at her fiercely. Just fire the bloody defense professor. You say that every year, said Professor McGonagall. Yes, and I'm always right. Constant vigilance or no, Alistair, the students must be taught, Moody snorted. Fa. I swear the curse gets worse every year, as you lot get more and more reluctant to let them go. Your precious Professor Quirrell would have to be Grindelwald in disguise to get himself sent off. Is he? Harry couldn't help asking. I mean, could he actually be? I check Grindy's cell every 2 months, Moody said. He was there in March. Could the person in the cell be a ringer? I administer a blood test for his identity, son. Where do you keep the blood you use as a reference? In a safe place. Something like a smile was stretching the scarred lips. Have you considered the Aura office after you graduate? Alastair, Professor McGonagall said reluctantly. The defense professor does have a health condition. I suppose you will call it suspicious in itself, but it is by no means certain that it will be any ill-doing on his part which prevents us from renewing his employment. Yes, his little nap times, Moody said darkly. Amelia thinks he stepped into the path of a high-level curse. Sounds to me more like a dark ritual gone wrong. You've no proof of that, Professor McGonagall said. That man might as well be wearing a sign saying, Dark Wizard, in glowing green letters over his head. Ah, Harry said. It didn't seem like an especially good time to ask what Mr. Moody thought of the not all sacrificial rituals are evil standpoint. Excuse me, but you said earlier that Professor Quirrell, I mean the old David Monroe, I mean the Monroe from the 70s. Anyway, you said that person used the killing curse. What does that imply? Does somebody have to be a dark wizard to use it? Moody shook his head. I've used it myself. All it takes is power and a certain mood. The grimacing lips were showing teeth. The first time I cast it was against a wizard named Gerald Grice, and you can ask me what he did after you graduate Hogwarts. But why is it unforgivable, then? Harry said. I mean, a cutting hex can kill someone too, so why is it any better to use a reducto instead of Avada Kedavra? Shut your mouth, Moody said sharply. Someone might take it the wrong way, you're saying that incantation. You look too young to cast it, but there's such a thing as polyjuice. And to answer your question, boy, there's 2 reasons why that spell's in the Blackest Book. The first is that the killing curse strikes directly at the soul, and it'll just keep going until it hits one. Straight through shields, straight through walls. There's a reason why even auras fighting Death Eaters weren't allowed to use it before the Monroe Act. Ah, said Harry. That does seem like an excellent reason to ban. I'm not finished, son. The second reason is that the killing curse doesn't just take a powerful bit of magic. You've got to mean it. You've got to want someone dead, and not for the greater good either. Killing Grice didn't bring back Blair Roch, or Nathan Rafuss, or David Capito. It wasn't for justice, or to stop him doing it again. I wanted him dead. You understand now, lad? You don't have to be a dark wizard to use that spell, but you can't be Albus Dumbledore either. And if you're arrested for killing with it, there's no possible defense. I see, murmured the boy who lived. You can't want the person dead as an instrumental value on the way to some positive future consequence. You can't cast it if you believe it's a necessary evil. You have to actually want them dead for the sake of being dead, as a terminal value in your utility function. A magically embodied preference for death over life, striking within the plane of pure life force. That does sound like a difficult spell to block. Not difficult, Moody snapped. Impossible, Harry nodded gravely. But David Monroe, or whoever, used the killing curse against a couple of Death Eaters even before they wiped out his family. Does that mean he already had to hate them? Like the martial arts story was probably true. Moody shook his head slightly. One of the dark truths of the killing curse, son, is that once you've cast it the first time, it doesn't take much hate to do it again. Damages the mind. Again Moody shook his head. No, it's the killing that does that. Murder tears the soul, but that's just the same if it's a cutting hex. The killing curse doesn't crack your soul. It just takes a cracked soul to cast. If there was a sad expression on the scarred face, it could not be read. But that doesn't tell us much about Monroe. The ones like Dumbledore who'll never be able to cast the curse all their lives, because they never crack no matter what. They're the rare ones, very rare. It only takes a little cracking. There was a strange, heavy feeling in Harry's chest. He wondered what exactly it had meant, that Lily Potter had tried to cast the killing curse at Lord Voldemort with her last breath. But surely it was forgivable. It was right and proper for a mother to hate the dark wizard who was coming to kill her baby, mocking her for how she couldn't stop him. There was something wrong with you as a parent if you couldn't cast Avada Kedavra in that situation. And no other spell could have gone past the Dark Lord's shields. You'd have to at least try to hate the Dark Lord enough to want him dead for the sake of dead, if that was the only way to save your baby. It only takes a little cracking. Enough, said Professor McGonagall. What would you have us do? Moody's smile twisted. Get rid of the defense professor and see if all your troubles mysteriously clear up. Bet you a galleon they do. Professor McGonagall looked like she was in pain. Alastair, but will you teach the classes? Said Moody. If I ever say yes to that question, check me for polyjuice, because it's not me. I'll test it experimentally, Harry said. And then, as everyone looked at him, I'll ask Professor Quirrell a question that the real David Monroe would know, like who else was in the Slytherin class of 1945, or something like that, hopefully without making it obvious. It won't be definitive proof. He could have studied the role, but it would be evidence. Still, Mr. Moody, even if Professor Quirrell isn't the original Monroe, I'm not sure that getting rid of him is a free action. He saved my life twice. What? Demanded Moody. When? How? Once when he knocked down a bunch of witches who were summoning me toward the ground. Once when he figured out that the Dementor was draining me through my wand. And if Professor Quirrell wasn't the one who set up Draco Malfoy in the first place, then he saved Draco Malfoy's life, and things would be a lot worse if he hadn't. If the defense professor isn't behind it all, he's not someone we can afford to just get rid of. Professor McGonagall nodded firmly. Hypothesis: Severus Snape, April 8, 1992, 9:03 p.m. Harry and Professor McGonagall now stood on the slowly turning stairs, turning without descending. Or at least one Harry stood upon those stairs. His other three selves had been left behind in the headmaster's office. Can I ask you a private question? Harry said, when he thought they were far enough away not to be heard. And in particular, private from the headmaster. Yes, Professor McGonagall said, not quite sighing. Though I hope you realize that I cannot do anything which conflicts with my duties to— Yes, Harry said. That's exactly what I need to ask you about. In front of the Wisengamot, when Lucius Malfoy was saying that Hermione was no part of House Potter and that he wouldn't take the money, you told Hermione how to swear that oath. I want to know, if something like that comes up again, if your first duty is to the Hogwarts student Hermione Granger or to the head of the Order of the Phoenix, Albus Dumbledore. Professor McGonagall looked like someone had hit her in the face with a cast-iron frying pan a few minutes earlier, and now she'd been told that somebody was about to do it again, and not to flinch. Harry flinched a little himself. Somewhere along the line he needed to pick up the knack of not phrasing things to hit as hard as he possibly could. The walls rotated around them, behind them, and somehow they descended. Oh, Mr. Potter, Professor McGonagall said with a low exhalation. I wish you wouldn't ask me such questions. Oh, Harry, I wasn't thinking then, not at all. I only saw a chance to help Miss Granger, and I was sorted into Gryffindor after all. You've got a chance to think now, Harry said. It was all coming out wrong, but he had to say it anyway because I'm not asking you to be loyal to me. But if you do know, if you are sure, what you'll do if it comes down to an innocent Hogwarts student versus the Order of the Phoenix a second time. But Professor McGonagall shook her head. I'm not sure, the Transfiguration professor whispered. I don't know if it was the right choice even then. I'm sorry. I can't decide such awful things. But you'll do something if it happens again, Harry said. Indecision is also a choice. You can't just imagine having to make an immediate decision. No, Professor McGonagall said, sounding a little stronger, and Harry realized that he'd accidentally offered a way out. The professor's next words confirmed Harry's fears. Such a dreadful choice as that, Mr. Potter. I think I should not make it until I must. Harry gave an internal sigh. He supposed he had no right to expect Professor McGonagall to say anything else. In a moral dilemma where you lost something either way, making the choice would feel bad either way, so you could temporarily save yourself a little mental pain by refusing to decide. At the cost of not being able to plan anything in advance, and at the cost of incurring a huge bias toward inaction or waiting until too late. But you couldn't expect a witch to know all that. All right, Harry said. Though it wasn't right at all, not really. Dumbledore might want that debt removed. Professor Quirrell would also want Harry out of that debt. And if the defense professor was David Monroe, or could convincingly appear to be David Monroe, then Lord Voldemort technically hadn't exterminated the House of Monroe. In which case, somebody might be able to pass a Wisengamot resolution revoking the noble status of House Potter, which had been granted for avenging the most ancient House of Monroe. In which case Hermione's vow of service to a noble house might be null and void, or maybe not. Harry didn't know anything about the legalities, especially not whether House Potter got the money back if someone managed to send Hermione to Azkaban. Just because you lost something might not mean the payment was returned, legally speaking. Harry wasn't sure, and he didn't dare ask a magical solicitor. It would have been nice to be able to trust at least one adult to take Hermione's side instead of Dumbledore's if an issue like that threatened to come up. The stairs they were upon ceased rotating, and they were before the backs of the great stone gargoyles, which rumbled aside, revealing the hallway. Harry stepped out. A hand caught at Harry's shoulder. "Mr. Potter," Professor McGonagall said in a low voice, "why did you tell me to keep watch over Professor Snape?" Harry turned around again. "You told me to keep watch and see if he'd changed," Professor McGonagall went on, her tone urgent. "Why did you say that, Mr. Potter?" It took a moment at this point for Harry to think back and remember why he had said that. Harry and Neville had rescued Lessath Lestrange from bullies, and then Harry had confronted Severus in the hallway, and at least according to the potion's master's own words, almost died. "I learned something that made me worry," Harry said after a moment. "From someone who made me promise not to tell anyone else." Severus had made Harry swear that their conversations wouldn't be shared with anyone, and Harry was still bound by it. "Mr. Potter," began Professor McGonagall, and then exhaled, the flash of sharpness disappearing as quickly as it had come. "Never mind. If you cannot say, you cannot say." "Why do you ask?" Harry said. Professor McGonagall seemed to hesitate. "All right, let me be more specific," Harry said. After Professor Quirrell had done it to him several times, Harry was starting to get the hang of it. "What change have you already observed in Professor Snape that you're trying to decide whether to tell me about?" "Harry," the Transfiguration Professor said, and then closed her mouth. "I obviously know something you don't," Harry said helpfully. "See, this is why we can't always put off trying to decide our awful moral dilemmas." Professor McGonagall closed her eyes, drew in a deep breath, pinched the bridge of her nose, and squeezed it several times. "All right," she said. "It's a subtle thing, but worrying. How can I put this? Mr. Potter, have you read many books that young children are not meant to read?" "I've read all of them." "Of course you have. Well, I don't quite understand it myself, but for so long as Severus has been employed in this school, stalking about in that awful stained cloak, there has been a certain sort of girl that stares at him with longing eyes." "You say that like it's a bad thing," Harry said. "I mean, if there's one thing I did understand from those books, it's that you're not supposed to question people's preferences." Professor McGonagall gave Harry a very strange look. "I mean," Harry said again, "from what I've read, when I'm a bit older, there's something like a 10% chance that I'll find Professor Snape attractive, and the important thing is for me to just accept whatever I... In any case, Mr. Potter, Severus has always been entirely indifferent to the stares of those young girls." But now Professor McGonagall seemed to realize something and hastily said, her hands rising in warding, "Please don't mistake me. Professor Snape certainly has not taken advantage of any young witches. Absolutely not. He has never even so much as smiled at one, not that I ever heard. He has told the young girls to stop gaping at him, and if they stare at him regardless, he looks away. That I have seen with my own eyes." "Ugh," Harry said. "Sorry, but just because I've read those books doesn't mean I understood them. What does all that mean?" "That he is noticing," Professor McGonagall said in a low voice. "It is a subtle thing, but now that I have seen it, I am certain, and that means, I am very much afraid, that the bond which held Severus to Albus's cause may have weakened or even broken. 2 plus 2 equals Snape and Dumbledore." Then Harry heard the words that had just come out of his mouth, and hastily added, "Not that there's anything wrong with that." "No," said Professor McGonagall. "Oh, for pity's sake. I can't explain it to you, Mr. Potter." The other shoe finally dropped. "He was still in love with my mother." This seemed somewhere between beautifully sad and pathetic for around 5 seconds before the third shoe dropped. Of course, that was before I gave him my helpful relationship advice. "I see," Harry said carefully after a few moments. "There were times when saying oops didn't fully cover it. You're right, that's not a good sign." Professor McGonagall put both hands over her face. "Whatever you're thinking right now," she said in a slightly muffled voice, "which I assure you is also wrong, I don't want to hear about it ever." "So," Harry said, "if, like you said, the bond that held Professor Snape to the headmaster has broken, what would he do then?" There was a long silence. What would he do then? Minerva lowered her hands, gazing down at the upturned face of the boy who lived. One simple question shouldn't have caused her so much dismay. She'd known Severus for years, the two of them bound, in some strange way, by the prophecy they'd both heard. Though Minerva suspected, from what she knew of the rules of prophecy, that she had only overheard it herself. It had been Severus's acts which had brought about the prophecy's fulfillment. And the guilt, the heartbreak which had come of that choice, had been tormenting the potion's master for years. She couldn't imagine who Severus would be without it. Her mind went blank, trying to imagine, her thoughts an empty parchment. Surely Severus was no longer the man he'd once been, that angry and terribly foolish young man who brought the prophecy before Voldemort in exchange for being admitted into the Death Eaters. She'd known him for years, and surely Severus was no longer that man. Did she really know him at all? Had anyone ever seen the real Severus Snape? I don't know, Professor McGonagall finally said. I truly don't know at all. I can't even imagine. Do you know anything of this, Mr. Potter? Harry said. I think I can say that my own evidence points in the same direction as yours. I mean, it increases the probability that Professor Snape isn't in love with my mother anymore. Professor McGonagall closed her eyes. I give up. I don't know of anything wrong he's done apart from that, though, Harry added. I assume the headmaster cleared you to ask me about this. Professor McGonagall looked away from him, staring at the wall. Please don't, Harry. All right, Harry said, and turned and hurried out into the hallways, hearing Professor McGonagall more slowly walking after and the rumbling sound of the gargoyles moving into place. It was the morning after next, during potions class, that Harry's potion of cold resistance boiled over his cauldron with a green froth and mildly nauseating smell, and Professor Snape, looking more resigned than disgusted, told Harry to stay after class. Harry had his own suspicions about this affair, and as soon as class let out Hermione, as usual for the last few days, being the first to flee out the door swung shut and locked behind the departing students. I apologize for ruining your potion, Mr. Potter, Severus Snape said quietly. There was upon his face the strange, sad look that Harry had seen only once before, in a hallway some time ago. It will not be reflected in your grades. Please, sit down. Harry sat back down at his desk, filling up the time by scrubbing a bit more at the green stain on the wooden surface as the potions master incanted a few privacy spells. When the potions master was done, he spoke again. I do not know how to broach this topic, Mr. Potter, so I will simply say it. Before the Dementor, you recovered your memory of the night your parents died. Harry silently nodded. I know it must not be a pleasant memory, but if you could tell me what happened. Why? Harry said. His voice was solemn, definitely not mocking the pleading look that Harry had never expected to see from that person. I wouldn't think that would be a pleasant thing for you to hear either, Professor. The potions master's voice was almost a whisper. I have imagined it every night these last 10 years. You know, said Harry Slytherin sighed, it might not be such a good idea to give him closure if his guilt-based loyalties are already wavering. Shut up. Overruled. It wasn't something that Harry could actually bring himself to deny. He took one suggestion from his Slytherin side, and that was it. Will you tell me exactly how you came to learn about the prophecy? Harry said. I'm sorry to make this a trade. I will tell you afterward, only it could be really important. There is little to say. I had come to be interviewed by the deputy headmistress for the position of potions master, and so I was waiting outside the room of the Hog's Head Inn when the applicant before me, Sybil Trelawney, came to seek the position of professor of divination. As soon as Trelawney finished speaking her words, I fled, forsaking my chance at Hogwarts's mastery, and went to the Dark Lord. The potions master's face was drawn and tight. I did not even pause to consider why that riddle might have come to me before I sold it to another. A job interview, Harry said, where you and Professor Trelawney both happened to be applying and Professor McGonagall was interviewing. That seems like rather a large coincidence. Seers are the pawns of time, Mr. Potter. Coincidence is beneath them, and they are above it. I was the one meant to hear that prophecy and become its fool. Minerva's presence made no final difference to how it came about. There was no memory charm, as you supposed. I do not know why you thought that, but there was no memory charm. There could have been no memory charm. The voice of a seer has a quality, an enigma which even legilimency cannot share. How could that be imbued in a false memory? Do you think the Dark Lord would believe my mere words? The Dark Lord seized my mind and saw the mystification there, even if he could not seize the mystery, and so he knew the prophecy had been true. The Dark Lord could have killed me then, having taken what he wanted. I was a fool indeed to go to him. But he saw something in me I do not know, and took me into the Death Eaters, though on his terms rather than mine. That is how I brought it all about, from beginning to end, always my own doing. Severus's voice had gone rather hoarse, and his face was filled with naked pain. Now tell me, please, how did Lily die? Harry swallowed twice, and began his recounting. James Potter shouted for Lily to run away with me, that he would hold off you-know-who. You-know, who said? Harry stopped, the chills going all over his own skin, his own muscles tightening as if in preparing for a seizure. The memory was returning strongly now, accompanied by cold and darkness in association. He used the killing curse. And then he came upstairs somehow. I think he must have flown. I don't remember any footsteps on stairs or anything like that. And then my mother said, "No, not Harry, please not Harry," or something like that. And the Dark Lord, his voice was so high, like water whistling out of a tea kettle, only cold. The Dark Lord said, "Stand aside, woman. For you I am not come, only the boy." The words were very clear in Harry's memory. He told my mother to get out of his way, that he was only there for me, and my mother begged him to have mercy, and the Dark Lord said, "I give you this rare chance to flee." That he was being generous and giving her a chance to run, but he wouldn't bother fighting her, and even if she died, she couldn't save me. Harry's voice was unsteady, and so she ought to get out of his way. And that was when my mother begged the Dark Lord to take her life instead of mine, and the Dark Lord said to her, and his voice was lower this time, like he was dropping a pose, "Very well, I accept the bargain." He said that he accepted her offer, and that she should drop her wand so he could kill her. And then the Dark Lord waited, just waited. I don't know what Lily Potter was thinking. It hadn't even made sense in the first place, what she said. It wasn't like the Dark Lord would kill her and then just leave, when he'd come there for me. Lily Potter didn't say anything, and then the Dark Lord started laughing at her, and it was horrible, and she finally tried the only thing left that wasn't abandoning me or just giving up and dying. I don't know if she even could have, if the spell would have worked for her, but when you think about, she had to try. The last thing my mother said was Avada Key, but the Dark Lord started his own curse as soon as she said Av, and he said it in less than half a second, and there was a flash of green light, and then, that's enough. Slowly, like a body floating to the surface of water, Harry returned from wherever he'd been. "That's enough," the potion's master said hoarsely. "She died." Lily died without pain then. The Dark Lord did not do anything to her before she died. She died thinking that she'd failed, and that the Dark Lord was going to kill her baby next. That's pain. He, the Dark Lord, didn't torture her, Harry said, if that's what you're asking. Behind Harry, the door unlocked itself and swung open. Harry left. It was Friday, April 10th of 1992. AD 7. Hedonic awareness. Thursday, April 16th, 1992. The school was almost deserted now, 9/10 of the students having gone home for the Easter holiday, just about everyone she knew missing. Susan had stayed behind, her grandaunt being quite busy, as had Ron for reasons she didn't know. Maybe the Weasley family was poor enough that feeding all the children for an extra week would have been a noticeable strain. It all worked out well enough, since Ron and Susan were just about the only ones left who'd still talk to her, at least that she wanted to talk back to. Lavender was still nice to her, and Tracy was, Tracy, but neither of them were quite relaxing to spend a free hour around, and in any case, neither of those two had stayed over for the Easter halls. If she couldn't go home, and she wasn't allowed to go home, her parents had been lied to and told she'd had glowpox, then an almost empty Hogwarts was the next best thing. She could even visit the library without people staring at her, since there were no lessons and nobody was trying to do schoolwork. It would be a mistake to think that Hermione drooped about the corridors weeping all day long. Oh, she'd cried a lot the first 2 days, of course, but 2 days had been enough. There were parts of Harry's borrowed books about that, how even people who were paralyzed in car accidents weren't nearly as unhappy as they'd expected to be 6 months later, just like lottery winners weren't nearly as happy as they'd expected. People adjusted. Their happiness levels went back to their happiness set point. Life went on. A shadow fell over where Hermione was reading her current book, and she whirled around, the wand hidden on her lap coming up to point directly at the surprised face of "Sorry," Harry Potter said, hastily holding up his palms to show his left hand empty and his right hand holding a small red velvet pouch. "Sorry. Didn't mean to startle you." There was an awful silence, her heartbeat increasing and her palms starting to sweat as Harry Potter just looked at her. She'd almost talked to him on the first morning of the rest of her life, but when she'd come down to breakfast, Harry Potter had looked so awful, so she hadn't sat down beside him at the breakfast table, just quietly eaten in her own little bubble of nobody else sitting next to her, and it had been horrible, but Harry hadn't come to her and she just hadn't talked to him since then. It wasn't hard to avoid everyone if you stayed out of the Ravenclaw common room and ran out of classes before anyone could talk to you. And ever since she'd been wondering what Harry thought of her now, if he hated her for having lost all his money, or if he really was in love with her, and that's why he'd done it, or if he'd given up on her keeping pace with him because she couldn't frighten Dementors. She couldn't face him now. She just couldn't. She spent sleepless nights worrying what Harry thought of her now, and she was afraid. And she'd been avoiding the boy who'd spent all his money to save her, and she was a horrible, ungrateful wretch. And a terrible person. And then her eyes glanced down to see that Harry was reaching into the red velvet pouch and taking out a heart-shaped, red foil-wrapped sweet, and her brain melted down like chocolate left out in the sun. "I was going to give you more space," said Harry Potter. "Only I was reading up on Critch's theories about hedonics and how to train your inner pigeon, and how small, immediate positive and negative feedbacks secretly control most of what we actually do. And it occurred to me that you might be avoiding me because seeing me made you think of things that felt like negative associations. And I really didn't want to let that run any longer without doing something about it. So I got a hold of a bag of chocolates from the Weasley twins, and I'm just going to give you one every time you see me as a positive reinforcement, if that's all right with you." "Breathe, Harry," Hermione said without thinking about it. It was the first word she'd spoken to him since the day of the trial. The two of them stared at each other. The books stared at them from the surrounding shelves. They stared some more at each other. "You're supposed to eat the chocolate," Harry said, holding out the heart-shaped sweet like a valentine. "Unless just being given a chocolate feels good enough to count as a positive reinforcement, in which case you probably need to put it in your pocket or something." She knew that if she tried speaking again she'd fail, so she didn't try. Harry's head slumped a bit. "Do you hate me now?" "No," she said. "No, you shouldn't think that, Harry. Just everything." She realized that her wand was still pointed at Harry, and she lowered it. She was trying very hard not to burst out into tears. "Everything," she repeated, and couldn't find any better to say than that, although she was certain that Harry wanted to tell her to be specific. "I think I understand," Harry said cautiously. "What ray are you reading?" Before she could stop him Harry bent over the library desk to see the book she was reading. Leaning his head forward before she could think to grab the book away, Harry stared at the open page. "The World's Wealthiest Wizards and How They Got That Way," Harry read off the book's title from the top. "Number 65, Sir Gareth, owner of a transportation company that won the 19th century shipping wars. Monopoly on OT3s. I see. I suppose you're going to tell me that I don't need to worry about anything and you'll take care of it all." It came out sounding harsher than she would have wanted, and she felt another stab of guilt for being such a terrible person. "Nah," Harry said, sounding oddly cheerful. "I can put myself in your shoes well enough to know that if you paid a bunch of money to save me, I'd be trying to pay it back. I'd know it was silly on some level, and I'd still be trying to pay it back all by myself. There's no way I wouldn't understand that, Hermione." Hermione's face screwed up, and she felt moisture in the corners of her eyes. "Fair warning, though," Harry went on. "I might solve the debt to Lucius Malfoy myself if I see a way before you do. It's more important to get that sorted immediately than which one of us gets it sorted. Anything interesting so far?" 3/4 of her was running in circles and smashing into trees as she tried to figure out the implications of everything Harry had just said. Did he still respect her as a heroine? Or did that mean he thought she couldn't do it on her own? And meanwhile, a much more sensible part of Hermione flipped back the book to page 37, which had the most promising entry she'd seen so far, though in her imagination she always did it on her own and took Harry completely by surprise. I thought this seemed quite interesting, her voice said. Number 14, Crozier, true name unknown, Harry read. Wow, that is the gaudiest checkered top hat I've ever seen. Wealth, at least 600,000 galleons. So around 30 million pounds. Not enough to make a muggle famous, but good enough for the smaller wizard population, I guess. Rumored to be a modern alias of the 6th-century-old Nicholas Flamel, the only known wizard to succeed at the incredibly difficult alchemical procedure for creating the Philosopher's Stone, which enables the transmutation of base metals into gold or silver, as well as the elixir of life, which indefinitely prolongs the youth and health of the user. Hermione, this seems obviously false. I've read more references to Nicholas Flamel, Hermione said. The Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts says he secretly trained Dumbledore to stand up to Grindelwald. There's a lot of books that take the story seriously, not just this one. You think it's too good to be true? No, of course not, said Harry. Harry pulled out the chair next to her own, at the small table, and sat down beside her in his accustomed place on her right, just like he'd never left. She had to choke back a catch in her throat. The idea of too good to be true isn't causal reasoning. The universe doesn't check if the output of the equations is too good or too bad before allowing it. People used to think that airplanes and smallpox vaccines were too good to be true. Muggles have figured out ways to travel to other stars without even using magic, and you and I can use our wands to do things that Muggle physicists think are literally impossible. I can't even imagine what we could rule out the real laws of magic being able to do. So what's the problem then? Hermione said. Her voice sounded more normal now in her own ears. Well, Harry said. The boy reached over her own outstretched arm, his robes brushing hers, and tapped the artist's illustration of an ominously glowing red stone dripping scarlet liquid. Problem one is that there's no logical reason why the same artifact would be able to transmute, lead to gold, and produce an elixir that kept someone young. I wonder if there's an official name for that in the literature. Like the turned up to 11 effect, maybe. If everyone can see a flower, you can't get away with saying flowers are the size of houses. But if you're in a flying saucer cult, since nobody can see the alien mothership anyway, you can say it's the size of a city or the size of the moon. Observable things have to be constrained by evidence, but when somebody makes up a story, they can make the story as extreme as they want. So the Philosopher's Stone gives you unlimited gold and eternal life, not because there's a single magical discovery that would produce both of those effects, but because someone made up a story about a super happy thingy. Harry, there's a lot of things in magic that aren't sensible, she said. Granted, said Harry. But Hermione, problem two is that not even wizards are crazy enough to casually overlook the implications of this. Everyone would be trying to rediscover the formula for the Philosopher's Stone. Whole countries would be trying to capture the immortal wizard and get the secret out of him. It's not a secret. Hermione flipped the page, showing Harry the diagrams. The instructions are right on the next page. It's just so difficult that only Nicholas Flamel's done it. So entire countries would be trying to kidnap Flamel and force him to make more stones. Come on, Hermione, even wizards wouldn't hear about immortality, and Harry Potter paused, his eloquence apparently failing him, and just keep going. Humans are crazy, but they're not that crazy. Not everyone thinks the same way you do, Harry. He did have a point, but how many different references had she come across to Nicholas Flamel? Besides world's wealthiest wizards and rise and fall of the dark arts, there'd also been stories of moderately ancient times and biographies of the justly famous. All right then, Professor Quirrell would have kidnapped this Flamel guy. It's what an evil person or a good person or just a selfish person would do if they had any sense. The defense professor knows a lot of secrets, and he wouldn't miss that one. Harry sighed and looked up. She followed his gaze, but he was apparently just looking at the larger library, the rows and rows and rows of bookcases. I don't mean to mess with your project, said Harry, and I certainly don't mean to discourage you, but Honestly, Hermione, I'm not sure you're going to find any good ideas for making money in a book like this. Like the old joke about how if an economist sees a £20 note lying in the street, they won't bother picking it up, because if it were real, someone else would have picked it up already. Any way of making lots of money that everyone knows about to the point where it's in books like this. You see what I'm saying? It can't be possible for everyone to make 1,000 galleons a month in 3 easy steps, or everyone would be doing it. So, that wouldn't stop you, Hermione said, her voice now roughening again. You do impossible things all the time. I bet you've done something impossible in the last week, and you didn't bother telling anyone. There was a slight pause, which, if Miss Granger had known, was exactly the length of pause you'd make if you'd fought Mad-Eye Moody and won exactly 8 days earlier. Not in the last 7 days, no, Harry said. Look, part of the trick of doing the impossible is being selective about which impossibilities you challenge, and only trying when you have a special advantage. If there's a money-making method in this book that sounds difficult for a wizard, but it's easy if we can use Dad's old Mac Plus, then we'd have a plan. I know that, Harry, Hermione said, her voice wavering only slightly. I was looking to see if there was anything here I could figure out how to do. I thought maybe the difficult part about making a philosopher's stone was that the alchemical circle had to be super precise, and I could get it right by using a muggle microscope. That's brilliant, Hermione. The boy rapidly drew his wand, said quietus, and then continued after the small noises of the rowdio books had died down. Even if the philosopher's stone is just a myth, the same trick might work for other difficult alchemies. Well, it can't work, Hermione said. She'd flown across the library to look up the only book on alchemy that wasn't in the restricted section. And then she remembered the crushing letdown, all the sudden hope dissipating like mist. Because all alchemical circles have to be drawn to the fineness of a child's hair. It isn't any finer for some alchemies than others. And wizards have omnioculars, and I haven't heard of any spells where you use omnioculars to magnify things and do them exactly. I should have realized that. Hermione, Harry said seriously, as he started to dig down into the red velvet pouch again, don't punish yourself when a bright idea doesn't work out. You've got to go through a lot of flawed ideas to find one that might work. And if you send your brain negative feedback by frowning when you think of a flawed idea, instead of realizing that idea suggesting is good behavior by your brain to be encouraged, pretty soon you won't think of any ideas at all. Harry put down 2 heart-shaped chocolates beside the book. Here, have another chocolate. Besides the one from earlier, I mean. This one is to reinforce your brain for generating a good candidate strategy. I suppose you're right, Hermione said in a small voice, but she didn't touch the chocolate. She started to turn the pages back to 167, where she'd been reading before Harry had come in. Hermione Granger did not require bookmarks, of course. Harry was leaning over slightly, his head almost touching her shoulder, watching the pages as she turned them, as though he might be able to glean valuable information from glimpsing the page for only a quarter second. Breakfast hadn't been long ago, and she could clearly identify from the faint scent of his breath that Harry'd eaten banana pudding for dessert. Harry spoke again. So with all that said, and please take this as a positive reinforcement, did you really try to invent a way to mass-produce immortality so that I could pay off my debt to Lucius Malfoy? Yes, she said, in an even smaller voice. Even when she tried to think like Harry, it seemed she hadn't yet got the knack of it. So what have you been doing this whole time, Harry? Harry made a disgusted face. Trying to collect evidence on the whole who framed Hermione Granger mystery. Hermione looked up at Harry. Shouldn't I be trying to solve my own mystery, though? It hadn't been her first thought, her first priority, but now that Harry mentioned it. That wouldn't work in this case, Harry said soberly. There's too many people who'll talk to me and not you. And I'm also sorry to say that some of them made me promise not to talk to anyone else. Sorry, I don't think you can help much on this one. Okay, I guess, Hermione said leadenly. Fine, you do everything. You gather all the clues and talk to all the suspects while I just sit here in the library. Let me know after it turns out that it was Professor Quirrell who did it. Hermione, Harry said. Why is it so important who does what? Shouldn't it be more important to get everything solved than who solves it? I guess you're right, Hermione said. She lifted her hands to press up at her eyes. I guess it doesn't matter anymore. Everyone's going to think, I know it's not your fault, Harry. You were being good. You were a perfect gentleman. but no matter what I do now, they'll all think that I'm just someone for you to rescue." She paused and said, with her voice quivering, "And maybe they're right, Harry." "Whoa, whoa, hold on there a second. I can't scare Dementors. I can get outstandings in Charms class, but I can't scare Dementors. I've got a mysterious dark side," Harry hissed, after his head turned around to scan the library. There was one boy in a distant corner who did look in their direction occasionally, but he would have been too far away to hear anything even without the quieting barrier. "I've got a dark side that definitely isn't a child. And who knows what other crazy magical stuff going on in my head," Professor Quirrell claimed, "that I become whoever I believe I am. That's all cheating. Don't you see, Hermione? There's an arrangement that the school administration made that I'm not supposed to talk about, so that the boy who lived could have more time to study every day. I'm cheating, and you're still beating me in Charms class." I'm probably not. The boy who lived probably isn't even something that you could properly call a child, and you're still competing with that. Don't you realize, if it wasn't for people paying attention to me, you'd look like the most powerful witch to come along in a century, when you can fight 3 older bullies by yourself and win? "I don't know," she said, pressing her hands again over her eyes, with her voice wavering. "All I know is, even if that's all true, nobody's ever going to see me for myself anymore, ever." "All right," Harry said after a while. "I see what you mean. Instead of the famous Potter and Granger research team, there'll be Harry Potter and his lab assistant. Here's an idea. How about if I don't focus on making money for a while? I mean, the debt doesn't come due until I graduate Hogwarts, so you can do it yourself and show the world you've still got it. And if you coincidentally crack the secret of immortality along the way, we'll just call it a bonus." The thought of Harry relying on her to come up with a solution seemed like a crushing burden of responsibility to dump on a poor, traumatized 12-year-old girl, and she wanted to hug him for offering her a way to restore her self-respect as a heroine, and it was what she deserved for being a horrible person and speaking sharply to Harry all the time, when all along he'd been a truer friend to her than she'd ever been to him, and it was good that he still thought she could do things. And is there some amazing rational thing you do when your mind's running in all different directions? She managed. "My own approach is usually to identify the different desires, give them names, conceive of them as separate individuals, and let them argue it out inside my head. So far, the main persistent ones are my Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, Gryffindor, and Slytherin sides, my inner critic, and my simulated copies of you, Neville, Draco, Professor McGonagall, Professor Flitwick, Professor Quirrell, Dad, Mum, Richard Feynman, and Douglas Hofstadter." Hermione considered trying this before her common sense warned that it might be a dangerous sort of thing to pretend. "There's a copy of me inside your head." "Of course there is," Harry said. The boy suddenly looked a bit more vulnerable. "You mean there isn't a copy of me living in your head?" There was, she realized, and not only that, it talked in Harry's exact voice. "It's rather unnerving now that I think about it," said Hermione. "I do have a copy of you living in my head. It's talking to me right now using your voice, arguing how this is perfectly normal." "Good," Harry said seriously. "I mean, I don't see how people could be friends without that." She continued reading her book then, Harry seeming content to watch the pages over her shoulder. She'd gotten all the way to number 70, Catherine Scott, who'd apparently invented a way to turn small animals into lemon tarts when she finally worked up the courage to speak. "Harry," she said. She was leaning a bit away from him now, though she didn't realize it. "If there's a copy of Draco Malfoy in your head, does that mean you're friends with Draco Malfoy?" "Well," Harry said. He sighed. "Yeah, I've been meaning to talk with you about this anyway. I kind of wish I'd talked to you sooner. Anyway, how can I put this? I was corrupting him." "What do you mean corrupting?" "Tempting him to the light side of the Force." Her mouth just stayed open. "You know, like the Emperor and Darth Vader, only in reverse." "Draco Malfoy," she said. "Harry, do you have any idea?" "Yes. The sort of things Malfoy has been saying about me. What he said he'd do to me as soon as he got the chance. I don't know what he told to you, but Daphne Greengrass told me what Malfoy says when he's in Slytherin. It's unspeakable, Harry. It's unspeakable in the completely literal sense that I can't say it out loud." "When was this?" Harry said. "At the start of the year. Did Daphne say when this was?" "No," Hermione said. "Because it doesn't matter when, Harry. Anyone who said things like Malfoy said they can't be a good person. It doesn't matter what you tempted him to, he's still a rotten person, because no matter what a good person would never, you're wrong. Harry said, looking her straight in the eyes. I can guess what Draco threatened to do to you, because the second time I met him, he talked about doing it to a 10-year-old girl. But don't you see, on the day Draco Malfoy arrived in Hogwarts, he'd spent his whole previous life being raised by Death Eaters. It would have required a supernatural intervention for him to have your morality given his environment. Hermione was shaking her head violently. No, Harry. Nobody has to tell you that hurting people is wrong. It's not something you don't do because the teacher says it's not allowed. It's something you don't do because you can see when people are hurting. Don't you know that, Harry? Her voice was shaking now. That's not a rule people follow like the rules for algebra. If you can't see it, if you can't feel it here, her hand slapped down over the center of her chest, not quite where her heart was located, but that didn't matter because it was all really in the brain anyway. Then you just don't have it. The thought came to her then that Harry might not have it. There's history books you haven't read, Harry said quietly. There's books you haven't read yet, Hermione, and they might give you a sense of perspective. A few centuries earlier, I think it was definitely still around in the 17th century. It was a popular village entertainment to take a wicker basket or a bundle with a dozen live cats in it and stop, she said. Roast it over a bonfire. Just a regular celebration. Good, clean fun. And I'll give them this. It was cleaner fun than burning women they thought were witches. Because the way people are built, Hermione, the way people are built to feel inside, Harry put a hand over his own heart, in the anatomically correct position, then paused and moved his hand up to point toward his head at around the ear level, is that they hurt when they see their friends hurting. Someone inside their circle of concern, a member of their own tribe. That feeling has an off switch labeled enemy or foreigner or sometimes just stranger. That's how people are if they don't learn otherwise. So no, it does not indicate that Draco Malfoy was inhuman or even unusually evil if he grew up believing that it was fun to hurt his enemies. If you believe that, she said with her voice unsteady, if you can believe that, then you're evil. People are always responsible for what they do. It doesn't matter what anyone tells you to do, you're the one who does it. Everyone knows that. No, they don't. You grew up in a post-World War II society where IVAS only following orders is something everyone knows, the bad guys said. In the 15th century, they would have called it honorable fealty. Harry's voice was rising. Do you think you're just genetically better than everyone who lived back then? Like if you'd been transported back to 15th century London as a baby, you'd realize all on your own that burning cats was wrong, witch burning was wrong, slavery was wrong, that every sentient being ought to be in your circle of concern. Do you think you'd finish realizing all that by the first day you got to Hogwarts? Nobody ever told Draco he was personally responsible for becoming more ethical than the society he grew up in. And despite that, it only took him 4 months to get to the point where he'd grab a muggle-born falling off a building. Harry's eyes were as fierce as she'd ever seen him. I'm not finished corrupting Draco Malfoy, but I think he's done pretty well so far. The problem with having such a good memory was that she did remember. She remembered Draco Malfoy grabbing her wrist, so hard she'd had a bruise afterward, while she was falling off the roof of Hogwarts. She remembered Draco Malfoy helping her up, after that mysterious tripping jinx had sent her stumbling into the Slytherin Quidditch captain's plate of food. And she remembered, it was, in fact, the reason she brought up the topic in the first place, how she'd felt when she'd heard Draco Malfoy's testimony under Veritaserum. Why didn't you tell me any of this? Hermione said, and despite herself, her voice rose in pitch. If I'd known, it wasn't my secret to tell you, Harry said. Draco's the one who would have been at risk if his father had found out. I'm not stupid, Mr. Potter. What's the real reason you didn't tell me, and what were you actually doing with Mr. Malfoy? Ah, well. Harry broke eye contact with her and looked down at the library table. Draco Malfoy told the Aurors under Veritaserum that he wanted to know if he could beat me, so he challenged me to a duel to test it empirically. Those were his exact words according to the transcript. Right, Harry said, still not meeting her eyes. Hermione Granger. Of course you'll remember the exact wording. It doesn't matter if she's chained to her chair, on trial for murder in front of the entire Wisengamot. What were you really doing with Draco Malfoy? Harry winced and said, probably not quite what you're thinking, but the horror scaled and scaled within her and finally broke loose. You were doing science with him. Well, you were doing science with him. You were supposed to be doing science with me. It wasn't like that. It's not like I was doing real science with him. I was just, teaching him some harmless bits of muggle science, like elementary physics with algebra and so on. It's not like I was doing original magical research with him, the way I was with you. And I suppose you didn't tell him about me either. Of course not, Harry said. I've been doing science with him since October, and he wasn't exactly ready to hear about you then. The inexpressible sense of betrayal inside her was welling and welling, taking over everything, her rising voice, her glaring eyes, her nose that she was certain was starting to run, the burning in her throat. She shoved herself up from the table and took a step back, the better to look down on her betrayer, and her voice was very nearly screeching as she yelled, "That is not okay. You can't do science with two people at once. You can't do science with two different people and not tell them about each other." Ah, Harry said cautiously. I did think of that, and I was very careful not to get your research mixed together with anything I did with him. You were being careful. She would have hissed it if it had contained any SS. Harry raised a hand and rubbed at his messy hair, and somehow that made her want to scream at him even more. Miss Granger, said Harry, I think this conversation has become metaphorical on a level that's, what? She screeched at him, at the top of her lungs inside their quieting barrier. Then she realized and got so red that if she'd had an adult level of magical power, her hair would have spontaneously caught on fire. The lone other patron in the library, the Ravenclaw boy sitting in the far opposite corner, was staring wide-eyed at both of them while making a rather sad attempt to conceal it by holding up a book just below his face. Right, Harry said with a small sigh. So, keeping firmly in mind that it was just a bad metaphor, and that real scientists collaborate with each other all the time, I don't think that I was cheating. Scientists often keep quiet about projects they're working on. You and I are doing research that we're keeping secret, and there were reasons not to tell Draco Malfoy in particular. He wouldn't have stayed around me at all, in the beginning, if he'd known I was your friend and not your rival. And Draco would have been the one at risk if I'd told anyone else about him. Is that really all? She said. Really, Harry? You didn't want both of us to feel special, like we were the only ones you wanted to be with, and the only ones who got to be with you. That was not why Harry paused. Harry looked at her. All the blood was rushing back into her face. There probably should have been steam coming out of her ears, which in turn should have been melting off her head with the liquid flesh running down into her neck as she realized what she just blurted out. Harry was staring at her in dawning and complete terror. Well, she said in a rather high-pitched voice, I don't know, Harry. Is it just a metaphor? When a boy spends 100,000 galleons to save a girl from certain doom, she's entitled to wonder, don't you think? It's like being bought flowers, only, you see, rather more so. Harry shoved himself up from the table and took a staggering step back, even as he brought up his arms to wave frantically. That's not why I did it. I did it because we're friends. Just friends. Harry Potter's breathing was starting to scale up toward hyperventilation. Very good friends. Extra special friends even, best friends forever, possibly, but not that kind of friends. Is it really that awful to think about? She said with a catch in her voice. I mean, I'm not saying I'm in love with you, but oh, you're not, thank goodness. Harry brought up the sleeve of his robe and wiped across his forehead. Look, Hermione, please don't misunderstand. I'm sure you're a wonderful person. She took a staggering step back. But even with my dark side, is that what this is about? Said Hermione. But I wouldn't. No, I have a mysterious dark side and probably other weird magic stuff going on. I'm not a normal child, not really. It's okay to not be normal, she said, feeling increasingly desperate and confused. I'm okay with it, but even with all that weird magical stuff letting me be more adult than I should be, I haven't gone through puberty yet, and there's no hormones in my bloodstream, and my brain is physically incapable of falling in love with anyone. So I'm not in love with you. I couldn't possibly be in love with you. For all I know at this point, 6 months from now my brain is going to wake up and decide to fall in love with Professor Snape. Can I take it from this that you have been through puberty?" "Eep," said Hermione in a high-pitched sound. She swayed where she stood, and a moment later Harry was rushing over to her side and helping lower her to sit on the ground, bracing her body with firm hands. The fact was that she had staggered over to Professor McGonagall's office back in December, not in total surprise because she'd done her reading, but still rather queasily, and it was with great relief that she'd learned that witches had charms to deal with the inconveniences. And what was Harry even doing asking a poor innocent girl a question like that? "Look, I'm sorry," Harry said frantically. "I really didn't mean most of that the way it sounded. I'm sure that anyone taking the outside view of the whole situation and offering betting odds on who I finally married would assign a higher probability to you than anyone else I can think of." Her intelligence, which had barely been starting to pull itself together, promptly exploded into sparks and flame. "Though not necessarily a probability higher than 50%, I mean. From the outside view, there's a lot of other possibilities. And who I like before I hit puberty probably isn't all that strongly diagnostic of who I'll be with 7 years later. I don't want to sound like I'm promising anything." Her throat was making some sort of high-pitched sounds, and she wasn't really listening to exactly what. All her universe had narrowed to Harry's terrible, terrible voice. "And besides, I've been reading about evolutionary psychology. And well, there are all these suggestions that one man and one woman living together happily ever afterward may be more the exception rather than the rule. And in hunter-gatherer tribes, it was more often just staying together for 2 or 3 years to raise a child during its most vulnerable stages. And I mean, considering how many people end up horribly unhappy in traditional marriages. It seems like it might be the sort of thing that needs some clever reworking, especially if we actually do solve immortality." Tana Wolfe, of fifth-year Ravenclaw, slowly stood up from his library desk, from which vantage point he just watched Granger flee the library sobbing. He hadn't been able to hear the argument, but it had clearly been one of those. Slowly, and with his knees trembling, Tano approached the boy who lived, who was staring in the direction of the library doors, still vibrating from the force of how they'd been slammed. Tano didn't particularly want to do this, but Harry Potter had been sorted into Ravenclaw. The boy who lived was, technically, his fellow Ravenclaw, and that meant there was a code. The boy who lived didn't say anything as Tano approached him, but his gaze wasn't friendly. Tano swallowed, laid a hand on Harry Potter's shoulder, and recited, his voice cracking only slightly, "Witches, go figure, huh? Remove your hand before I cast it into the outer darkness." The library doors slammed open again in the wake of another departure. 88. Time Pressure, PT1. April 16th, 1992. 12:07 p.m. Lunchtime. Harry stomped over to the mostly deserted Gryffindor table, determining at a glance that lunch today was Breen and Rupert balls. The ambient conversation, Harry could likewise hear, was Quidditch-related, an auditory environment which rated somewhat worse than the sound of rusty chainsaws, but better than what the Ravenclaw table was still blithering about Hermione. Gryffindor House, at least, had started out less sympathetic to Draco Malfoy and had more political incentive to wish that everyone would just forget certain unfortunate facts. And if that wasn't the right reason for silence, it was at least silence. Dean and Seamus and Lavender were all gone for the holidays, but at least that left. What was all that ruckus at the head table? Harry said to the Weasley twin group mind as he began to serve himself his own plate. It looked like it was just ending as I walked in. Our beloved, but clumsy Professor Trelawney seems to have gone and dropped an entire soup tureen on herself, not to mention Mr. Hagrid. A quick glance at the head table confirmed that the divination professor was waving her wand frantically as the half-giant dabbed at his clothes. Nobody else seemed to be paying much attention, even Professor McGonagall. Professor Flitwick was standing on his chair as usual. The headmaster seemed to be absent again. He'd been gone most days of the holiday. Professors Sprout and Sinistra and Vector were eating in their usual grouping. "And you know," Harry said, as he turned his head away to stare at the ceiling illusion of a clear blue sky, "that still creeps me out sometimes." "What does?" said Fred or George. The powerful and enigmatic defense professor was resting, or whatever the heck was wrong with him. his hands making fumbling, hesitant grabs at a chicken leg that seemed to be eluding him on the plate. Nothing," said Harry. "I'm not quite used to Hogwarts yet." Harry continued to eat in moderate silence, as various Weasleys discussed some bizarre mind-affecting substance called Chudley Cannons. "What sort of deep, mysterious thoughts are you thinking?" said a young-looking witch with short hair, sitting nearby. "I mean, just curious. I'm Brienne, by the way." She was gazing at him with one of those looks which Harry had firmly decided to just ignore until he was older. "So," Harry said, "you know those really simple artificial intelligence programs like Eliza that are programmed to use words in syntactic English sentences, only they don't contain any understanding of what the words mean?" "Of course," the witch said. "I have a dozen of them in my trunk." "Well, I'm pretty sure my understanding of girls is somewhere around that level." A sudden hush fell. It took a few seconds for Harry to realize that, no, the entire Great Hall wasn't staring at him, and then Harry twisted his head around to look. The figure who just staggered into the Great Hall appeared to be Mr. Filch, Hogwarts's token hallway monitor, who, along with his predatory cat, Mrs. Norris, constituted a low-level random encounter whom Harry often breezed past, wearing his epic-level Deathly Hallow. Harry had once consulted the Weasley twins about pulling some sort of prank on this deserving target, whereupon Fred or George had quietly pointed out that Mr. Filch was never seen to use a wand, which was odd, really, considering how many spells would be useful in that position. And it made you wonder why Dumbledore had given the man a position at Hogwarts, and Harry had shut up. Right now Mr. Filch's brown clothing was disarrayed and soaked with sweat, his shoulders were visibly heaving as he breathed, and his ever-present cat was missing. "Troll," gasped Mr. Filch. In the dungeons, Minerva McGonagall stood up from the head table so quickly that her chair fell to the ground behind her. "Argus," she cried, "what happened to you?" Argus Filch staggered forward from the huge doors, his upper body streaked and darted with small crimson darts as though someone had spattered steak sauce over his face. "Troll grey, twice as tall as me, it did." Argus Filch covered his face with his hands. "It ate Mrs. Norris, ate her all up. In just one bite, Minerva felt a stab of dismay in her other self. She hadn't liked the other cat very much, but the two of them had still been felines. An uproar started from the great hall. Severus stood up from the head table, somehow doing so without drawing any visible attention to himself, and strode out the huge doors without another word. Of course, Minerva thought, the third-floor corridor, this could be a distraction. She mentally consigned all such matters to Severus's care, drew her wand, raised it high, and let out 5 sharp cracks of purple fire. There was stunned silence, but for Argus's broken sobs. "It seems we have a dangerous creature loose in Hogwarts," she said to the faculty at the head table. "I will ask you all to aid in searching the halls." Then she turned to the stunned and watching students and raised her voice. "Prefects, lead your houses back to the dormitories immediately." Percy Weasley leaped up from the Gryffindor table. "Follow me," he said in a high voice. "Stick together, first years." "No, not you." But by that time, the other prefects were raising their own voices as a renewed babble sprang up. Then a clear, cool voice spoke under the sudden rush of sound. "Deputy Headmistress." She turned. The defense professor was calmly wiping off his hands on a napkin as he stood up from the head table. "With respect," said the man of unknown identity, "you are not expert in battle tactics, madam. In this situation, it would be wiser to—" "I do apologize, Professor," said Professor McGonagall as she turned toward the great doors. Phileas and Pomona had already risen to follow her, with Rubeus Hagrid towering over all of them as the half-giant stood up. She'd been through similar experiences too many times at this point. "Sad experience has taught me that on occasions such as these, it is not a good time to take any advice the current defense professor may offer. Indeed, I think it wise that the two of us search for the troll together, so that no suspicions may be cast upon you for any untoward events which occur during that time." Without any hesitation, the defense professor swung smoothly on the Gryffindor table and clapped his hands with a sound like a floor cracking through. "Michelle Morgan of House Gryffindor, second in command of Panini's army," the defense professor said calmly into the resulting quiet. "Please advise your head of house." Michelle Morgan climbed up onto her bench and spoke, the tiny witch, sounding far more confident than Minerva, remembered her being at the start of the year. Students walking through the hallways would be spread out and impossible to defend. All students are to remain in the great hall and form a cluster in the center. Not surrounded by tables, a troll would jump right over tables, with the perimeter defended by seventh-year students. From the armies only, no matter how good they are at dueling, so they don't get in each other's lines of fire. Michelle hesitated. I'm sorry, Mr. Hagrid, but it wouldn't be safe for you. You should stay behind with the students. And Professor Trelawney shouldn't confront a troll on her own either. Michelle sounded much less apologetic about this part. But if she's paired with Professor Quirrell, the two of them together can form an additional trusted and effective battle unit. That concludes my analysis, Professor. Adequate for being put on the spot, the defense professor said. 20 Quirrell points to you, but you neglect the still simpler point that home does not mean safe, and a troll is strong enough to rip a portrait door off its hinges. Enough, Minerva snapped. Thank you, Miss Morgan. She looked to the watching tables. Students, you will do as she said. Turned back to the head table. Professor Trelawney, you will accompany the defense professor. Ah, Sybil said falteringly. Beneath her overdone makeup and mess of shawls, the woman looked rather pale. I'm afraid I'm not entirely well today. Indeed, I feel rather faint. You won't have to fight the troll, Minerva said sharply, her patience taxed as usual when dealing with the woman. Just stay with the defense professor, and do not let him out of your sight for an instant. You must be able to testify afterward that you were with him at all times. She turned to Rubeus. Rubeus, I am leaving you in charge here. Keep them safe. The huge man straightened at this, losing his glum look and nodding proudly to her. Then Minerva looked at the students and raised her voice. It should go entirely without saying that anyone leaving the Great Hall for any reason will be expelled. No excuses will be accepted. Am I understood? The Weasley twins, with whom she'd been making direct eye contact, nodded respectfully. She turned without another word and marched off toward the hall doors with the other professors behind her. On the far side of the room, unnoticed on the wall, a clock showed 12:14 p.m. And he still didn't realize. Tick. As Harry stared with narrowed eyes at where the professors had gone out, wondering what was actually going on and what it meant, as the students came together into a more defensible mass, and wands flicked to levitate the tables out of their way, Harry still didn't realize. Tick. Shouldn't the professors all have formed up into pairs? Said an older Gryffindor student whose name Harry didn't know. I mean, it'd be slower, but it'd be safer, I think. Tick. Someone else replied to this, raising her voice, but Harry didn't catch much of it. The gist was that mountain trolls were highly magic-resistant and incredibly strong, and could regenerate, but they were still noisy, so if you heard them coming, it shouldn't be that hard for a Hogwarts professor to wrap them up in Vadim's unbreakable something-something. Tick, and Harry still didn't realize. Tick. The crowd noises were subdued. People were talking in low voices to each other while they glanced around, listening for the sound of a crashing door or an angry roar. Tick. Some students were speculating in whispers about what the defense professor could possibly be trying to achieve by smuggling in a troll, and whether he was angry that Professor McGonagall had caught on to his attempted distraction, and what it was a distraction from. Tick. And the thought still didn't come to Harry. Not until after all the students had formed a mass of perhaps 100 bodies, patrolled by proudly grim-looking seventh-year students, with their wands all pointed outward. And somebody suggested doing a head count, and someone else replied sarcastically that this might have made sense on some other day. But right now, practically, everyone was gone for the spring holiday, and nobody really knew how many students were supposed to be in the room, let alone if any were missing. Tick. That was when Harry wondered where Hermione was. Tick. Harry looked over at where the Ravenclaws had clustered. He didn't see Hermione, but then everyone was packed tightly enough together that you wouldn't expect to see smaller students through the crowd, amid the upper years. Tick. Harry then looked over at the Hufflepuffs to see if he could spot Neville, and even though Neville was standing behind a much taller student, Harry's visual processing managed to spot him almost immediately. Hermione wasn't with the Hufflepuffs either, not that Harry could see, and she certainly wouldn't be with the Slytherins. Tick. Harry pushed his way through the packed crowd, stepping beside or around older students, and in one case just ducking between their legs, until he was standing among the Ravenclaws and could definitely verify that nope, no Hermione. Tick. Hermione Granger, Harry said loudly. Are you here? Nobody answered. Tick. Somewhere in the back of his mind was a rising sense of horror, as other parts of him tried to decide exactly how much to panic. The first defense class of the year was rather fuzzy in Harry's mind, but he distantly remembered something about trolls being able to track prey that was alone and undefended. Tick. Another track of thought searched frantically through inchoate possibilities. What could he do exactly? It wasn't 3 p.m., yet so he couldn't reach this now using his time turner. Even if he could sneak out of the room, there had to be some way to put on his cloak without being noticed, some sort of distraction he could use. He had no idea where Hermione was, and Hogwarts was huge. Tick. Another part of his mind tried to model possibilities. From what that other student had said, trolls weren't silent predators. They were noisy. Hermione won't have any idea it's a troll, so she'll go investigate the noise. She's a heroine, isn't she? But Hermione now had an invisibility cloak and a broomstick in her pouch. Harry had insisted on that part for both her and Neville, and Professor McGonagall had told him it had been done. That ought to be enough to let Hermione get away, even if she was lousy on a broomstick. All she had to do was get onto a section of roof. It was a clear day, and sunlight was supposed to be bad for trolls somehow. Harry remembered that part, and therefore Hermione would remember it exactly. And surely, even if Hermione wanted to prove herself again, she couldn't possibly be dumb enough to attack a mountain troll. Tick. She wouldn't. Tick. That just wasn't her. Tick. And then it occurred to Harry that somebody had previously tried to frame Hermione Granger for murder using memory charms, had done so inside Hogwarts without setting off any alarms, and had arranged for Draco to die slowly enough that it wouldn't set off the wards until at least 6 hours later, when nobody could use a time turner to check, and that whoever was clever enough to infiltrate a troll past the ancient wards of Hogwarts without the headmaster coming to investigate the strange creature could be clever enough to also take the obvious step of jinxing Hermione's magic items. Tick. Was a part of him that felt something like slowly rising panic as perspective shifted, a Necker cube changing orientation. What the hell had Harry been thinking, letting Hermione and Neville be kept inside Hogwarts just because of them being given a few stupid trinkets that wasn't going to stop anyone who wanted to kill them? Tick. Another part of his mind put up resistance. That possibility wasn't certain. It was complex, and the probability could easily be under 50%. It was easy to imagine going into a huge panic in front of everyone, and then Hermione getting back from the washrooms outside the Great Hall, or if the troll ended up not going anywhere near her. Like in the story of the boy who cried wolf, nobody would believe him the next time if she really was in trouble. It could use up reputational credit that he would later need for something else. Tick. Harry recognized an instance of the fear of embarrassment schema that stopped most people from ever doing anything under conditions of uncertainty and squashed it down hard. Even then, it was strange how much willpower it took to muster the decision to shout out loud in front of everyone. If he just hadn't seen Hermione in the crowd, it was going to be embarrassing. Tick. Harry drew in a deep breath and shouted as loudly as he could, Hermione Granger, are you here? The students all turned to look at him. Then some of them turned around to look around themselves. The noise around the room went down in volume as some conversation stilled. Has anyone seen Hermione Granger since around 10:30 today or so? Does anyone have any idea where she might be? The background babble stilled further. Nobody raised their voice to shout anything at him, in particular not, Don't worry, Harry, I'm right here. Oh, Merlin, somebody said from nearby, and then the background babble started up again, taking on a new and excited tone. Harry stared down at his hands, shutting out the yammering, and tried to think, tick, tick, tick. Susan Bones and a red-headed boy with a battered-looking wand both shoved their way through the crowd to Harry at the same time. We've got to let the professors know somehow. We've got to go find her, Susan snapped, rounding on the other boy. How'll we do that, Captain Weasley? We'll go off and look for her, Ron Weasley snapped back. Are you nuts? There's already professors searching the hallways. What makes you think we've got any better chance than them of running across General Granger? Only we'll get eaten by the troll. and then expelled. It was odd how sometimes hearing bad ideas made the right idea obvious by contrast. All right, everyone, listen up. People turned to look. Quiet, everyone, shut up. Harry's throat ached after that, but he had everyone's attention. I have a broomstick, Harry said as loudly as he could manage with his throat still hurting. He'd remembered Azkaban and the broomstick which had only sat two when he'd requested one that could carry three. It's a three-seater. I need 1/7 year from the armies to come with me. We're going to fly through the hallways as fast as possible looking for Hermione Granger, pick her up, and come back immediately. Who's with me? The great hall became entirely silent then. Students glanced at each other uneasily. The younger students looked expectantly at the older students, while they in turn turned to look at the students who were guarding the perimeter. Most of those were staring straight ahead, pointing their wands just in case the troll picked that moment to burst through a wall. No one moved. No one spoke. Harry Potter spoke again. We're not going to fight the troll. If we see, it will just fly away, and there's no way it'll be able to keep up with us on a broomstick. I'll take responsibility for squaring it with the administration. Please. People went on looking at other people. Harry stared at the silent crowd, the dozen seventh years looking sternly outward, feeling the coldness coming over him. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Professor Quirrell was laughing scornfully and mocking the idea that ordinary fools would ever do something useful of their own will without a wand pointed at their heads. Tick. The standard remedy for bystander apathy was to focus on a single individual. All right, Harry said, trying to keep the commanding voice of the boy who lived who didn't doubt obedience. Miss Morgan, come with me now. We've got no time to waste. The witch he'd named turned from where she'd been staring steadily out at the perimeter, her expression aghast for the 1 second before her face closed up. The deputy headmistress ordered us all to stay here, Mr. Potter. It took an effort for Harry to unclench his teeth. Professor Quirrell didn't say that, and neither did you. Professor McGonagall isn't a tactician. She didn't think to check if we had missing students, and she thought it was a good idea to start marching students through the hallways. But Professor McGonagall understands after her mistakes are pointed out to her. You saw how she listened to you and Professor Quirrell, and I'm certain that she wouldn't want us to just ignore the fact that Hermione Granger is out there, alone, tick. I'd expect the professor to say she'd not wish any more students roaming the halls. The professor said if anyone left for any reason, they'd be expelled. Maybe you don't need to worry because you're the boy who lived, but the rest of us do. Tick. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Professor Quirrell was just laughing at him, expecting some normal person to act without perfect strategic clarity, without a clear focus of responsibility on them personally when they had a good excuse to do nothing. A student's life is at stake, Harry said in a level voice. She could be fighting the troll right now. Out of curiosity, does that mean anything to you at all? Tick, Miss Morgan's face twisted. You're the boy who lived. Just go off by yourself and snap your fingers if you want to help her. Tick, Harry was hardly even aware of what he was saying. That's just cleverness and bluffing. I don't have any power like that in real life. A young girl needs your help now. Are you a Gryffindor or not? Why are you saying any of this to me? Cried Miss Morgan. I wasn't left in charge here. Mr. Hagrid was. There was an awkward pause that suffused the whole room. Harry spun to look up at the huge half-giant towering over the crowd of students, as all other heads also turned toward him as one. Mr. Hagrid, Harry said, trying to keep his voice commanding. You need to authorize this expedition, and you need to do it now. Rubeus Hagrid looked conflicted, though that was hard to judge with his vast head so surrounded by his unshorn beard and locks. Only his eyes looked alive, embedded in all that hair. "Eh," said the half-giant. I was told to keep Yerrol safe. Great. Now can we also keep Hermione Granger safe? You know, the student framed for a murder she did not commit who needs someone to help her. The half-giant startled as Harry spoke the words. Harry stared at the enormous man, desperately willing him to pick up on the hint, hoping the words hadn't given it away to anyone else. He couldn't be just muscle. Surely James and Lily had been friends with this man out of more than pity. Framed. Called out an anonymous voice from somewhere over near where the Slytherins gathered. Ha, are you still on that? It'd serve her right if she did get eaten. There was some laughter, even as cries of indignation came from elsewhere. The half-giant's face firmed up. Yes, stay here, lad. Mr. Hagrid said, in a booming tone that was probably meant to be gentle. "I'll go and look for her myself. Truth is, trolls can be a mite tricky. Ye've got to catch 'em by an ankle and dangle 'em just right, or they'll rip ye clean in half. Can you ride a broomstick, Mr. Hagrid?" Rubius Hagrid frowned. "No." "Then you can't search fast enough. Sixth years, calling all sixth years. Are there any sixth years here who aren't worthless cowards?" Silence. "Fifth years. Mr. Hagrid, tell them they're authorized to go with me and keep me safe. I'm trying to be sensible, damn it." The half-giant wrung his hands with an agonized expression. "AI." Something snapped inside Harry, and he started to stride directly toward the doors to the Great Hall, pushing aside anyone who didn't get out of his way as though they were doughy statues. He didn't run, because running was an invitation for somebody to stop you. Somewhere in his mind, he was moving through an empty room filled with mechanical puppets, by whose meaningless lip-moving noises he'd been distracted. A huge figure interposed itself in his way. Harry looked up. "I can't let ye do that, Harry Potter. Not ye of all people. There's strange things afoot in this castle, and someone might be after Miss Granger, or they might be after ye." Rubius Hagrid's voice was regretful but firm, and his gigantic hands lay at his side like forklifts. "I can't let ye go out there, Harry Potter." Stupefy, the red bolt crashed into the side of Hagrid's head and made the huge man startle. His head snapped around faster than anything that large should have moved and bellowed, "What do ye think ye're doing?" at the young form of Susan Bones. "Sorry," she screamed. "Incendium, Glissio." The huge man's hands, now slapping at the fire in his beard, didn't quite manage to catch himself as he crashed to the floor. But it didn't matter by then, because Harry was past him, and Neville Longbottom stepped in front of him, looking desperate but determined, the Hufflepuff boy's wand already level in his hand. Harry's hand went for his wand in a sheer reflex action. He barely managed to check himself before Neville could fire on him, staring at his lieutenant as though the world had gone mad. "Harry," Neville burst out. "Harry, Mr. Hagrid's right. You can't. This could all be a trap. They could be after you." All of Neville's muscles went rigid, and he toppled to the ground, stiff as a board. A pale-looking Ron Weasley stepped out from behind Neville, his own wand level, and said, "Go." "Ron, you madman, what are you doing?" came a voice distantly identifiable as Miss Clearwater's boyfriend. But Harry was already dashing for the door without looking back, even as Ron's voice and Susan's voice rose again in incantation. There was a huge, indignant bellow, and unknown voices began to yell. Then Harry was through, his hand reaching into his pouch, and his voice was saying, "Broomstick," as behind him the great doors began to swing shut again. Harry continued running through the entrance hall, even as the long three-person broomstick and its sets of stirrups began to protrude from the pouch, repeating a number of swear words in his head, and thinking this is what happens when you try to be sensible with the part of his mind that wasn't trying to figure out a search pattern to cover places where Hermione might be. The library was on the third floor and practically on the other side of the castle. Harry had almost reached the great marble staircase by the time the broomstick was in his hand, and up. He was in the air and accelerating up toward the second floor. "Gah!" Harry screamed, and barely managed to spin his broom in the air so that he didn't impale one of the human figures lurking at the top of the stairs. There was a ghastly moment of trying not to fall off the broom, perform the twists that would keep him in the stirrups, despite being really close to the ground and having almost no room to maneuver, and then, "Fred, George, we can't figure out how to find her," one of the Weasley twins blurted, hands twisting in distress. "We snuck out because we thought we could find Miss Granger. There has to be a quick way to find anyone inside the Hogwarts castle. We're both sure of it, but we can't figure out what it is." Harry stared at both of them, from where he was hanging upside down from the broomstick where his desperate maneuver had brought him, and entirely by reflex his mouth said, "Well, why were you so sure you could find her?" "We don't know," cried the other Weasley twin. "You've been able to find people inside Hogwarts before?" "Yes, we," and the Weasley twin who was speaking stopped abruptly, both redheads staring off into the distance with a blank expression. There was a thundering crash, as of two huge doors being shoved open by someone very, very strong. Harry spun around in the air to present the two open stirrup positions on the broomstick to the Weasley twins. He didn't say anything, There was no reason for them to give away their positions if they didn't have to. Time seemed to move too slowly as the Weasley twins scrambled into the stirrups, Harry's heart beating hard, despite his mental calculation that Mr. Hagrid, running, shouldn't reach even the foot of the stairway in time. Then the three of them were accelerating hard and away toward the nearest corridor, the stone floor beneath them blurring, and the walls seeming to make an audible whooshing sound, though that was just the wind in their ears as they went past. Harry remembered that he was riding a longer three-person broomstick, barely in time to slow down for the next turn. And now all the broomstick seats were occupied, but if they actually found Hermione, then Harry could put on the cloak of invisibility that should hide him from the troll, and that would free up a seat for Hermione. Harry ducked hard before a sudden archway took his head off. "We found Jessie," the Weasley twins seated behind Harry blurted. "I know we did. That time we needed to tell him that Filch was hunting for him." "How?" Harry said, most of his brain engaged in not dying in a horrible air accident. He should have slowed down for safety, but there was a tension rising in him, a sourceless dread. He couldn't slow down. Something terrible would happen if he slowed down. "We," said the Weasley twins seated lower down. "We can't remember." Another sharp turn taken at, Harry estimated, roughly 0.3% of the speed of light, and they were going through a twisty, curving corridor that Harry always took to get from the Great Hall to the library, only it wasn't the shortest way if you were on a broomstick. He should have taken the long, straight west corridor instead. The part of his brain that wasn't steering caught up with reality. "Someone's been tampering with your minds," Harry yelled as he weaved through the curving corridor so fast that the tail-end Weasley sometimes lightly smacked into the wall as the length of the broomstick conflicted with Harry's maladapted air skills. "What?" cried Fred or George. "Whoever got to Hermione messed with your minds too." It could be an obliviation. It could be a false memory that hadn't been planted right. But right now Harry couldn't think. The broomstick turned and shot upward beside a spiral staircase. All three of them flattened themselves against the broomstick so they could make in through the gap in the ceiling that opened onto the third floor. And then they were in front of the library, the broomstick slowing to a halt with a shriek, despite the lack of anything it could be friction braking against. Harry shot the Weasley twins a quick glance to stay put as he clambered off the broomstick to shove open the doors of the library, controlling his breathing as he shoved his head inside. Hermione Granger wasn't there. Madam Pince, who was eating a sandwich at her desk, looked up with a sudden glare. "Library's closed. Have you seen Hermione Granger?" Harry said. "I said the library's closed, boy. Lunch hours. This is extremely important." "Have you seen Hermione Granger, or do you have any idea where she might be?" "No, now be off. Do you have any fast way of contacting Professor McGonagall in an emergency?" "Eh?" said the librarian, startled. She rose up from behind her desk. "What is yes or no? Please answer immediately." "Ah, there's the flu. She's not in her office," Harry said. "Do you have any other way of reaching her? Yes or no?" "Young man, I insist that you." Harry's brain flagged this as I'm talking to NPCS again, and he spun on his heel and dashed back for the broomstick. "Stop!" cried Madam Pince, bursting too late from the doors as Harry and the Weasley twins shot off again, out of the librarian's sight. The pressure in Harry's mind still rising, like a physical hand squeezing his chest. He had to find Hermione, and he had no other notion of where she could be, unless it was the witches' dorms in the Ravenclaw Tower, and that he couldn't enter. Searching all of Hogwarts bordered on a mathematical impossibility. There probably was no continuous flight path that entered all the rooms at least once. Why hadn't he thought to demand for Hermione and Neville, and him to be given a set of those neat little mirrors the auras used to communicate? The realization that he was being stupid hit Harry like a blow to the stomach. He didn't need mirrors to send a message. He hadn't needed mirrors since January. Harry slowed the broomstick to a halt in midair of a hallway, his wand already coming into his hand, the driving will to protect Hermione Granger rising to the front of his mind like a sun of silver fire, and flowing down his arm as he cried, "Expecto Patronum." And the blazing white humanoid burst into existence like a nova, the Weasley twins' voices crying aloud in shock. Tell Hermione Granger that there's a troll loose in Hogwarts. It could be hunting for her. She needs to get into direct sunlight now. The silver figure turned as though it was departing and then vanished. Merlin's underpants, breathed Fred or George. The silver outline blasted back into the world and said in the strange outside version of Harry's own voice, Hermione Granger says. The blazing figure's voice became higher-pitched. Ah! Time seemed to fracture, like everything was moving very quickly and slowly at the same time. A desperate impulse to accelerate the broomstick, fly at its maximum speed. Only Harry didn't know where. If you know where she is, Harry shouted to the blazing humanoid figure, staring into it as though it were a sun. Then take me to her. The silver blaze moved, and Harry accelerated after it, the Weasley twins giving out high-pitched shrieks behind him as he fired through the air like a cannonball, moving faster than sanity. He didn't focus on the walls whizzing past him or how fast he was moving, just followed the silver light through corridors and flying up staircases and blitzing through doors that Fred or George cried desperate incantations to open, and it was all still taking too much time. Somewhere deep inside Harry felt like he was sinking through molasses as windows and portraits shot past. The broomstick screamed through a final turn that whacked one of the Weasley twins against the wall not quite as hard as a bludger would hit, and then they followed the brilliant Patronus through an open space in the ceilings, blasting up and upwards, rising past one floor and then another in less than a breath. His Patronus slowed to a halt, Harry braking hard in response. Just as they reached the level of a wide-open floor space that spread out until it escaped the ceiling and turned into an outdoor terrace, a spread of tiled marble open to the air and sky. 89. Time pressure, PT2. Cool blue fires clung to the floor in small masses, surrounding a blazing pool that seemed to burn with a deadlier, hotter blue. In one narrow circle, the marble tiles were scorched and shattered by some explosive spell that only the most prodigious of first-year witches could have cast, with the last of her strength. On the terrace, still moving beneath the open sunlight, stood a great lumpy creature of dull granite grey. Body like a boulder with small bald head perched on top like a stone, short legs, thick as tree trunks with flat, horny feet. One hand held a tremendous stone club as long and as wide as an adult human, and the other hand held the Weasley twins screamed. Harry's Patronus shattered. The troll snorted and spun around to face them, dropping into the red pool that had spread out beneath its feet, raising its club high. Then a Weasley cried an incantation, and the club was torn from the troll's hand, smashed into its face so hard it drove the troll back for one of its steps, a blow that might have killed a muggle. The troll gave a bellow of anger, its nose squashed and blood spattered, and then the nose straightened once more, regenerated. The troll grabbed with both hands for the club, which shot away through the air, but only barely dodged the grab. "Lead it away, keep it off me," said a voice. The levitated club moved backwards from the troll, from the terrace onto the wide-open floor beneath the ceiling, and the troll made a great prodigious leap that almost brought the club into its hands. Then the troll made another great leap as the club moved to one side, and the broomstick moved forwards, and Harry jumped off and ran towards where Hermione Granger was lying in a pool of her own blood, with her legs eaten away to the upper thighs. Harry's hands tore open the healer's kit from his pouch, grabbed one of the self-tightening tourniquets, wrapped them around one ragged, tooth-marked stump, his hands briefly slipping in the blood. They didn't tremble. There wasn't any allowance for his hands to tremble. As the tourniquet formed a complete loop, it tightened hard, and more blood came out. But then the bleeding stopped on that thigh stump, and Harry turned to the other. Part of his mind was screaming, 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 and even the part of him picking up the other self-tightening tourniquet heard it, but that also wasn't allowed. The two Weasley twins were shouting spells, one after another in rapid-fire casting that would have had Harry unconscious in 60 seconds. Sometimes the twins shouted 2 spells simultaneously in perfect coordination, but most of the spells were disrupting in harmless showers of sparks against the troll's skin. As the other tourniquet tightened itself in another pulse of blood, Harry looked up at a defindo/reducto that made the troll's vulnerable eyes explode in twin showers of vitreous humor, but the troll only bellowed once more, its eyes already reforming. Fire and acid, Harry shouted. Use fire or acid. Fuego, slash, incendio. Harry heard, but he wasn't looking. He was reaching for the syringe of glowing orange liquid that was the oxygenating potion, pushing it into Hermione's neck at what Harry hoped was the carotid artery, to keep her brain alive even if her lungs or heart stopped. So long as her brain stayed intact, everything else could be fixed. It had to be possible for magic to fix it. It had to be possible for magic to fix it. It had to be possible for magic to fix it. And Harry pushed the plunger of the syringe all the way down, creating a faint glow beneath the pale skin of her neck. Harry then pushed down on her chest, where her heart should be, hard compressions that he hoped was moving the oxygenated blood around to where it could reach her brain. Even if her heart might have stopped beating, he hadn't actually thought to check her pulse. Then Harry stared at the other things in his medical kit, his mind going blank as he tried to figure out what else of what was there, if anything, he could use. The screaming in that distant corner of his mind was getting louder, much louder, now that his hands had stopped their frantic motions. He was suddenly aware of the liquid sensation where blood had soaked through his robes and the knees of his pants. From behind Harry came the sound of another bellow from the troll, and he heard one of the Weasley twins shout, "Deligiter Prodiers." And then, "Help, do something." Harry twisted his head back to look, and saw that one of the Weasley twins was somehow now wearing the sorting hat on his head, facing off against the troll which held the huge stone club in both its hands, looking somewhat scorched now, and with one or two smoking scars across its arms, but still intact. And then the voice of the hat bellowed in a voice so loud it seemed to shake the walls, "Gryffindor." A pulse of power burned the air, magic feeling almost tangible even to Harry's young senses. The troll jumped back a pace with a snort of surprise. Fred, or George, with a strange look on his face, swept the hat off his head with a motion smooth as a magician's trick, and reached in with one hand and drew forth a hilt whose pommel was a glowing ruby, followed by a wide crossguard of gleaming white metal and a blade as long as a tall child. As the sword was revealed, the air seemed to fill with a silent scream of fury. Upon the blade was written in golden script, "Nihil Supernum." Then the Weasley twin raised the sword aloft, as though the huge blade weighed nothing, and screamed and charged. Harry's lips opened to say something, some long sentence like, "No, stop. You have no idea how to use a sword," but not even a single syllable left his lips before the sword sliced off the troll's right arm through the elbow, cutting through skin and flesh and bone like jelly. Just as the already swinging arc of the stone club smashed into the charging Weasley twin and sent him flying through the air above the marble floor, over the gap out of which they'd risen on the broomstick, until that Weasley hit the wall on the opposite side and then collapsed into an unmoving heap. The bright sword vanished down into the opening in the floor, clattering distantly as it dropped. "Fred!" screamed George Weasley, and then Ventus. An invisible blow caught the troll and hurled it sideways through the air. Ventus! The troll was hit again, blown to the edge of the floor and the gap leading downwards. Ventus! But the troll had reached down and grabbed at the floor, its remaining hand crunching through marble to gain a firm hold. The third blow sent the troll's body over the gap, but the hand remained at the edge. And then the troll was pulling itself back up single-handedly, roaring. George Weasley staggered, almost falling, his hand dropping to his side. "Harry," the Weasley twin said in a strained voice. "Run!" The remaining Weasley twin took a step sideways, slumped against the wall, and slid to the ground. Time was fractured in Harry's mind. The world around him seemed to move slowly, distorted, or perhaps it was his own mind twisting and folding. He should have been moving, doing something, but a strange paralysis seemed to be stopping all his muscles, all his motions. Without any time for words, thoughts came in flashes of concepts. That if Harry ran away, the troll would eat the Weasley twins as well as Hermione. That if bludgers didn't kill wizards, then Fred should still be alive. That the Weasley twins were more powerful spellcasters than him, and they hadn't been able to hold back the troll. There was no time to transfigure anything he didn't already possess. The troll seemed too agile to be lured over the edge of the terrace, to fall off the sides of the Hogwarts castle. Someone had enchanted the troll against sunlight before using it as a murder weapon, and might also have strengthened it in other ways. And then a mental image of Hermione running from the troll, running for sunlight, finally reaching the bright terrace with the troll hot on her heels, only to find that someone else had thought of that possibility, too. The screaming horror in his mind was drowned out by another emotion. Harry stood up. On the other side of the room, the enemy had also risen, the unregenerating stump of one sword-cut arm still bloody. Intent to kill, the troll grasped its fallen club in its remaining hand and gave a huge bellow, smashing the club into the floor and sending marble chips flying. Think purely of killing, the troll began to lumber towards where George had fallen, a thin string of drool trailing from the side of its lips. Grasp at any means to do so, Harry took 5 strides forward, and the enemy gave another bellow and turned away from George, its eyes focusing squarely on him. Sensors off, do not flinch, the third most perfect killing machine in nature bounded towards him in leaping steps. Kill Harry's left hand already held the transfigured diamond from his ring, his right hand already held his wand. Wingardium Leviosa. Harry's wand directed the tiny jewel into the troll's mouth. Finite incantatum. The troll's head blew off its spine as the rock expanded back into its old form, and Harry stepped aside as the enemy's body crashed where he'd been standing. The enemy's head was already beginning to regenerate, the ragged stump of the jaw and spine smoothing over, the mouth completing itself and replacing its teeth. Harry bent down and picked up the troll's head by its left ear. His wand jammed through the troll's left eye, plunging through the jelly-like material and passing through the wide socket in the bone. Harry visualized a 1 millimeter wide cross-section through the enemy's brain and transfigured it into sulfuric acid. The enemy stopped regenerating. Harry threw the corpse over the edge of the terrace and turned back to Hermione. Her eyes were moving and focused on him. Harry scrambled down beside her, ignoring the blood soaking more of his already soaked robes. "You'll be all right." His brain formed the sentence, but his lips wouldn't move. "You'll be all right. We'll find some magic to fix all this, put you back to normal. Just hold on." Don't. Hermione's lips were moving, just a tiny bit, but they were moving. "Your fault." Time froze. Harry should have told her not to talk to save her breath, only he couldn't unblock his lips. Hermione drew in another breath, and her lips whispered, "Not your fault." Then she exhaled and closed her eyes. Harry stared at her with his mouth half open, his breath caught in his throat. "Don't do this," said his voice. He'd only been 2 minutes late. Hermione suddenly convulsed, her arms twitching into the air as though reaching up for something, and her eyes flew open again. There was a burst of something that was magic, and also more. A shout louder than an earthquake, and containing 1,000 books, 1,000 libraries, all spoken in a single cry that was Hermione. Too vast to be understood, except that Harry suddenly knew that Hermione had whited out the pain and was glad not to be dying alone. For a moment it seemed like the outpouring of magic might take root in the castle's stone. But then the outpouring ended and the magic faded. Her body stopped moving, and all motion halted as Hermione Jean Granger ceased to exist. Harry stood up from the body, swaying. No. There was a burst of flame, and Dumbledore was standing there with Fawkes, his eyes filled with horror. "I felt a student die." "What?" The old wizard's eyes saw what lay upon the ground. "Oh, no," whispered Albus Dumbledore. Fawkes gave a sad, mournful croon. "Bring her back." There was silence on the terrace. Fred Weasley had risen up into the air at a gesture from Dumbledore's wand and was floating towards them, surrounded by a reassuring pink glow. "Harry," the old wizard began, his voice cracked. "Harry, have Fawkes cry on her or whatever. Hurry up." The voice that spoke sounded perfectly calm. I can't, Harry. It's too late. She's dead. I don't want to hear about it." "If it was me lying there, you pull some kind of amazing rabbit out of your hat and save me, right? Because the hero isn't allowed to die before the story's over." "Well, she's the hero too, so whatever you were saving for that extra special occasion, just go ahead and use it now. I promise I'll pay you back. There isn't anything I can do. Her soul has departed. She's passed on." Harry opened his mouth to scream out all his fury, and then closed it again. There wasn't any point in screaming. It wouldn't accomplish anything. The unbearable pressure rising inside him couldn't be let out that way. Harry turned away from Dumbledore and looked down at where the remains of Hermione Granger were lying in a pool of blood. Part of his mind was hammering at the world around him, trying to make it go away. wake up from the nightmare, and find himself back in his Ravenclaw dorm room with the morning sun shining through the curtains. But the blood remained, and Harry didn't wake up, and another part of him already knew that this event was real, part of the same flawed world that included Azkaban and the Wisengamot chamber, and no, with a fracturing feeling, as though time was still torn to pieces around him. Harry turned away from Dumbledore and looked down at the remains of Hermione Granger lying in a pool of blood with 2 tourniquets tied around her thigh stumps, and decided no. I do not accept this. There isn't any reason to accept it, not when there's magic in the world. Harry would learn whatever he had to learn, invent whatever he had to invent, rip the knowledge of Salazar Slytherin from the Dark Lord's mind, discover the secret of Atlantis, open any gates or break any seals necessary, find his way to the root of all magic, and reprogram it. He would rip apart the foundations of reality itself to get Hermione Granger back. The crisis is over, the defense professor said. You may dismount, madam. Trelawney, who had been sitting behind him on the 2-person broomstick that had just blazed through Hogwarts, burning directly through all the walls and floors in their way, hastily pulled herself off and then sat down hard on the floor, a pace away from the red glowing edges of a newly made gap in the wall. The woman was still breathing in gasps, bending over herself, as though she were on the verge of vomiting out something larger than she was. The defense professor had felt the boy's horror, through the link that existed between the two of them, the resonance in their magic, and he had realized that the boy had sought the troll and found it. The defense professor had tried to send an impulse to retreat, to don the cloak of invisibility and flee, but he'd never been able to influence the boy through the resonance, and hadn't succeeded that time either. He'd felt the boy give himself over fully to the killing intention. That was when the defense professor had begun burning through the substance of Hogwarts, trying to reach the battle in time. He'd felt the boy exterminate his enemy in seconds. He'd felt the boy's dismay as one of his friends died. He'd felt the fury the boy had directed at some annoyance who was likely Dumbledore, followed by an unknown resolution whose unyielding hardness even he found adequate. With any luck, the boy had just discarded his foolish little reluctances. Unseen by anyone, the defense professor's lips curved up in a thin smile. Despite its little ups and downs, on the whole this had been a surprisingly good day. He is here. The one who will tear apart the very stars in heaven. He is here. He is the end of the world. 90 rolls, PT1. A simple innervate from the headmaster had awakened Fred Weasley, followed by a preliminary healing charm for a broken arm and cracked ribs. Harry's voice had distantly told the headmaster about the transfigured acid inside the troll's head. Dumbledore had looked down over the side of the terrace and made a gesture before returning, and then about the Weasley twins' minds having been tampered with, carrying on a separate conversation that Harry remembered but could not process. Harry still stood over Hermione's body. He hadn't moved from that spot, thinking as fast as he could through the sense of dissociation and fragmented time. Was there anything he should be doing now, any opportunities that were passing irrevocably? Some way to reduce the amount of magical omnipotence that would be required later? A temporal beacon effect to mark this instant for later time travel, if he someday found a way to travel back further than 6 hours. There were theories of time travel under general relativity, which had seemed much less plausible before Harry had run across time turners, and those theories said you couldn't go back to before the time machine was built. A relativistic time machine maintained a continuous pathway through time. It didn't teleport anything. But Harry didn't see anything helpful he could do using spells in his lexicon. Dumbledore wasn't being very cooperative, and in any case this was several minutes after the critical location within time. Harry, the headmaster whispered, laying his hand on Harry's shoulder. He had vanished from where he was standing over the Weasley twins and come into existence beside Harry. George Weasley had discontinuously teleported from where he was sitting to be kneeling next to his brother's side, and Fred was now lying straight with his eyes open and wincing as he breathed. "Harry, you must go from this place." "Hold on," said Harry's voice. "I'm trying to think if there's anything else I can do." The old wizard's voice sounded helpless. "Harry, I know you do not believe in souls, but whether Hermione is watching you now or no, I do not think she would wish for you to be like this." No, it was obvious. Harry leveled his wand at Hermione's body. "Harry, what are you?" and poured everything down his arm into his hand. "Frigidero." "Doing." "Hypothermia," Harry said distantly as he staggered. It had been one of the spells he and Hermione had experimented on a lifetime ago, so he was able to control it precisely, though it had taken a lot of power to affect that much mass. Hermione's body should now be at almost exactly 5 degrees Celsius. People have been revived from cold water after more than 30 minutes without breathing. The cold protects you from brain damage, you see. It slows everything down. There's a saying Muggle doctors have, "You're not dead until you're warm and dead." I think they even cool down the patient during some surgeries if they have to stop someone's heart for a while. Fred and George started sobbing. Dumbledore's face was already streaked with tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Harry, I'm so sorry, but you have to stop this." The headmaster took Harry by the shoulders and pulled on him. Harry allowed himself to be turned away from Hermione's body, walked forward as the headmaster pushed him away from the blood. The cooling charm would buy him time. Hours at least, maybe days if he could manage to keep casting the spell on Hermione, or if they stored her body somewhere cold. Now there was time to think. Minerva had seen Albus's face, and she'd known something was wrong. There had been time for her to wonder what had happened, and even who had died. Her mind flashing to Alastor, to Augusta, to Arthur and Marley, all the most likely targets at the start of Voldemort's second rise. She had thought that she had steeled herself. She had thought herself ready for the worst. Then Albus spoke, and all the steel left her. Not Hermione, no, Albus gave her a brief space to weep, and then told her that Harry Potter, who had watched Miss Granger die, had seated himself outside the infirmary storeroom where Miss Granger's remains were being kept, refusing to move from the spot, and telling anyone who spoke to him to go away so he could think. The only thing that had elicited any reaction from the boy was when Fawkes had tried to sing to him. Harry Potter had shrieked at the Phoenix not to do that. His feelings were real. He didn't want magic trying to heal them like they were a disease. After that, Fawkes had refused to sing again. Albus thought that she might have the best chance of reaching Harry Potter now. So she had to pull herself together and clean up her face. There would be time later for private grief, when her surviving children no longer needed her. Minerva McGonagall pulled together the dislocated pieces of herself, wiped her eyes a final time, and laid her hand on the doorknob of the infirmary section, whose back storeroom was now being used, for the second time this century, and for the 5th time since the castle of Hogwarts had been raised, as the resting place of a promising young student. She opened the door. Harry Potter's eyes gazed at her. The boy was sitting on the floor in front of the door to the back storeroom and holding his wand in his lap. If those eyes were grieving, if they were empty, if they were even broken, it couldn't be seen from looking at the boy's face. There were no dried tears on those cheeks. "Why are you here, Professor McGonagall?" Harry Potter said. "I told the headmaster I'd like to be left alone for a while." She couldn't think of anything to say. "To help you, you're not all right," but she didn't know what to say. There was nothing she could imagine saying that would make things better. She hadn't planned ahead before she'd walked into the room, having not been at her best. "What are you thinking about?" Minerva said. It was the only sentence that came into her mind. Albus had told her that Harry had been saying, over and over, that he was thinking, and she had to get Harry talking somehow. Harry stared half at her and half past her, a tension coming into his face as she held her breath. It took a while before Harry spoke. "I'm trying to think if there's anything I should be doing right now," said Harry Potter. "It's hard, though. My mind keeps on imagining ways the past could have gone differently if I'd thought faster, and I can't rule out that there might be a key insight in there somewhere." "Mr. Potter," she said falteringly. "Harry, I don't think it's healthy for you to be thinking like that. I disagree. It's not thinking that gets people killed." The words were spoken in a level monotone, as though reciting lines from a book. "Harry," she said, hardly even thinking as she said it, "there's nothing you could have done." Something flickered in Harry's expression. His eyes seemed to focus on her for the first time. "Nothing I could have done." Harry's voice rose on the last word. "Nothing I could have done." I've lost track of how many different ways I could have saved her. If I'd asked to have us all given communications mirrors, if I'd insisted on Hermione being taken out of Hogwarts and put in a school that isn't insane, if I'd snuck out immediately instead of trying to argue with normal people, if I'd remembered the Patronus earlier, if I'd thought through possible emergencies and trained myself to think about Patronuses earlier. Even at the very last minute, it might not have been too late. I killed the troll and turned to her, and she was still alive, and I just knelt next to her listening to her last words like an idiot, instead of casting the Patronus again and calling Dumbledore to send Fox. Or if I'd just approached the whole problem from a different angle, if I'd looked for a student with a time turner to send a message back in time before I found out about anything happening to her, instead of ending up with an outcome that can't be altered. I asked the headmaster to go back and save Hermione, and then fake everything. Fake the dead body, edit everyone's memories. But Dumbledore said that he tried something like that once, and it didn't work, and he lost another friend instead. Or if I'd only gone with if that night. Harry pressed his hands over his face, and when he removed them again, his face was calm and composed once more. Anyway, said Harry Potter, now in a monotone again, I don't want to repeat that mistake, so I'm going to spend until dinner time thinking if there's anything I should be doing. If I haven't thought of anything by then, I'll go to dinner and eat. Now please go away. She was aware now that tears were sliding down her cheeks again. Harry, you have to believe that this isn't your fault. Of course it's my fault. There's no one else here who could be responsible for anything. No, you know who killed Hermione. She was hardly aware of what she was saying, that she hadn't screened the room against who might be listening. Not you. No matter what else you could have done, it's not you who killed her, it was Voldemort. If you can't believe that, you'll go mad, Harry. That's not how responsibility works, Professor. Harry's voice was patient, like he was explaining things to a child who was certain not to understand. He wasn't looking at her anymore, just staring off at the wall to her right side. When you do a fault analysis, there's no point in assigning fault to a part of the system you can't change afterward. It's like stepping off a cliff and blaming gravity. Gravity isn't going to change next time. There's no point in trying to allocate responsibility to people who aren't going to alter their actions. Once you look at it from that perspective, you realize that allocating blame never helps anything unless you blame yourself, because you're the only one whose actions you can change by putting blame there. That's why Dumbledore has his room full of broken wands. He understands that part at least. Some distant part of her mind made a note to wait until much later and then speak sharply to the headmaster about what he was showing to impressionable young children. She might even scream at him this time. She'd been thinking about screaming at him anyway because of Miss Granger. You're not responsible, she said, though her voice trembled. It's the professors, it's us who are responsible for student safety, not you. Harry's eyes flicked back to her. You're responsible. There was a tightness in the voice. You want me to hold you responsible, Professor McGonagall? She raised her chin and nodded. It would be better, by far, than Harry blaming himself. The boy pushed himself up from where he was sitting on the floor and took a step forward. All right then, Harry said in a monotone. I tried to do the sensible thing when I saw Hermione was missing and that none of the professors knew. I asked for a seventh-year student to go with me on a broomstick and protect me while we looked for Hermione. I asked for help. I begged for help, and nobody helped me. Because you gave everyone an absolute order to stay in one place or they'd be expelled. No excuses. No matter what else Dumbledore gets wrong, he at least thinks of his students as people, not animals that have to be herded into a pen and kept from wandering out. You knew you weren't any good at military thinking. Your first idea was to have us walking through the hallways. You knew some students that were better than you at strategy and tactics, and you still nailed us down in one room without any discretionary judgment. So when something you didn't foresee happened, and it would have made perfect sense to send out a seventh-year student on a fast broom to look for Hermione Granger, the students knew you wouldn't understand or forgive. They weren't afraid of the troll, they were afraid of you. The discipline, the conformity, the cowardice that you instilled in them delayed me just long enough for Hermione to die. Not that I should have tried asking for help from normal people, of course, and I will change and be less stupid next time. But if I were dumb enough to allocate responsibility to someone who isn't me, that's what I'd say. Tears were streaming down her cheeks. That's what I'd tell you if I thought you could be responsible for anything. But normal people don't choose on the basis of consequences. They just play roles. There's a picture in your head of a stern disciplinarian, and you do whatever that picture would do, whether or not it makes any sense. A stern disciplinarian would order the students back to their rooms, even if there was a troll roaming the hallways. A stern disciplinarian would order students not to leave the hall on pain of expulsion. And the little picture of Professor McGonagall that you have in your head can't learn from experience or change herself, so there isn't any point to this conversation. People like you aren't responsible for anything. People like me are, and when we fail, there's no one else to blame. The boy strode forward to stand directly before her. His hand, darted beneath his robes, brought forth the golden sphere that was the ministry-issued protective shell of his time turner. He spoke in a dead, level voice without any emphasis. This could have saved Hermione if I'd been able to use it, but you thought it was your role to shut me down and get in my way. Nobody has died in Hogwarts in 50 years. You said that when you locked it. Do you remember? I should have asked again after Bellatrix Black got loose from Azkaban, or after Hermione got framed for attempted murder. But I forgot because I was stupid. Please unlock it now before any of my other friends die. Unable to speak, she brought forth her wand and did so, releasing the time-keyed enchantment she'd laced into the shell's lock. Harry Potter flipped open the golden shell, looked at the tiny glass hourglass within its circles, nodded, and then snapped the case shut. "Thank you. Now go away." The boy's voice cracked again. "I have to think." She closed the door behind her, an awful and still mostly muffled sound escaping her throat. Albus shimmered into existence beside her, taking on a brief garish hue as the disillusionment wore off. She did not jump, quite. "I've told you, stop doing that," Minerva said. Her voice sounded dull in her own ears. "That was private." Albus flickered his fingers at the door behind her. "I was afraid Mr. Potter might do you some harm." The headmaster paused, then said quietly, "I am very surprised that you stood there and took that. All I had to do was say, 'Mr. Potter,' and he would have stopped." Her voice had dropped almost to a whisper. Just that, and he would have stopped. And then he would have had no one to say those awful things to, no one at all. "I thought Mr. Potter's remarks were entirely unfair and undeserved," Albus said. "If it had been you, Albus, you would not have threatened to expel anyone leaving the room. Can you honestly tell me otherwise?" Albus's brows rose. "Your role in this disaster was tiny, your decisions quite sensible at the time, and it is only Harry Potter's perfect hindsight that lets him imagine otherwise. Surely you are wiser than to blame yourself for this, Minerva." She knew perfectly well that Albus would be placing a picture of Hermione in that awful room of his, that it would occupy a place of honor. Albus would hold himself responsible, she was certain, even though he hadn't even been in Hogwarts at the time. But not her. "So you also don't think it's worth the trouble of holding me responsible?" She slumped against the nearest wall, trying not to let the tears emerge again. She'd never seen Albus weep save thrice. "You have always believed in your students, as I never have. They would not have been afraid of you. They would have known you would understand. Minerva, I am not fit to succeed you as headmistress. We both know it." "You are wrong," Albus said quietly. "When the time comes, you will be the 45th headmistress of Hogwarts, and you will do an excellent job of it." She shook her head. "What now, Albus? If he will not listen to me, then who?" It was perhaps half an hour later. The boy still guarded the door to where his best friend's body lay, sitting his vigil. He was staring downward at his wand as it lay in his hands. Sometimes his face screwed up in thought, at other times it relaxed. Although the door did not open, and there was no sound, the boy looked up. He composed his face. His voice, when he spoke, was dull. "I don't want company." The door opened. The defense professor of Hogwarts entered into the room and shut the door behind him, taking up careful position in a corner between two walls, as far away from the boy as the room permitted. A sharp sense of catastrophe had risen in the air between the two of them and hung there unchanging. "Why are you here?" said the boy. The man tilted his head slightly. Pale eyes examined the boy as though he were a specimen of life from a distant planet and correspondingly dangerous. "I've come to apologize, Mr. Potter," the man said quietly. "Apologize for what?" the boy said. "Why, what could you have done to prevent Hermione's death?" "I should have thought to check for the presence of yourself, Mr. Longbottom, and Miss Granger, all of whom were obvious next targets," the defense professor said without hesitation. "Mr. Hagrid was not mentally equipped to command the student contingent. I should have ignored the deputy headmistress's request for silence, and told her to leave behind Professor Flitwick, who would have been better able to defend the students from any threat and who could have maintained communication via Patronus. Correct. The boy's voice was razor-sharp. I'd forgotten there was someone else in Hogwarts who could be responsible for things, so why didn't you think of it, Professor? Because I don't believe that you were stupid. There was a pause, and the boy's fingers whitened on his wand. You did not think of it either, Mr. Potter, at the time. There was a weariness in the defense professor's voice. I am smarter than you. I think faster than you. I am more experienced than you. But the gap between the two of us is not the same as the gap between us and them. If you can miss something, then so can I. The man's lips twisted. You see, I deduced at once that the troll was but a distraction from some other matter, and of no great importance in itself. So long as nobody sent the students wandering pointlessly through the halls, or uncaringly dispatched the young Slytherins to those very dungeons where the troll had been spotted. The boy did not seem to relax. I suppose that is plausible. In any case, said the man, if there is anyone who can be said to be responsible for Miss Granger's death, it is myself, not you. It is I, not you, who should have. I perceive that you have spoken to Professor McGonagall and that she has given you a script to follow. The boy did not bother keeping the bitterness from his voice. If you have something to say to me, Professor, say it without the masks. There was a pause. As you wish, the defense professor said emotionlessly. The pale eyes stayed keen and sharp. I do regret that the girl is dead. She was a good student in my defense class and could have been an ally to you later. I would wish to console you for your loss, but I cannot see how to go about doing so. Naturally, if I find the ones responsible, I shall kill them. You are welcome to join in should circumstances permit. How touching, the boy said, his voice cool. You are not claiming to have liked Hermione, then? Her charms were lost on me, I suspect. I no longer form such bonds easily. The boy nodded. Thank you for being honest. Is that all, Professor? There was a pause. The castle is scarred now, said the man standing in the corner. What? When a certain ancient device in my possession informed me that Miss Granger was on the verge of death, I cast that spell of cursed fire of which I once spoke. I burned through some walls and floors so that my broomstick could take a more direct path. The man still spoke tonelessly. Hogwarts will not heal such wounds easily, if at all. I suppose it will be necessary to patch over the holes with lesser conjurations. I regret that now, since I was in any case too late. Ah, said the boy. He closed his eyes briefly. You did want to save her. You wanted it so strongly that you made some sort of actual effort. I suppose your mind, if not theirs, would be capable of that. A brief, dry smile from the man. Thank you for that, Professor. But I would like to be left alone now until dinner time. You of all people will understand. Is that all? Not quite, the man said. A tinge of sardonic dryness now returned to his voice. You see, based on recent experiences, I am concerned that you may now intend to do something extremely foolish. Such as what? Said the boy. I am not quite sure. Perhaps you have decided that a universe without Miss Granger is devoid of value and should be destroyed for the insults it has dealt you. The boy smiled without any humor. Your own issues are showing, Professor. I don't really go in for that sort of thing. Did you at some point? Not particularly. I have no great fondness for the universe, but I do live there. There was a pause. What are you planning, Mr. Potter? Said the man in the corner. You have come to some significant resolution, though you are trying to hide it from me. What do you now intend? The boy shook his head. I'm still thinking, and would like to be left alone to do it. I recall an offer you once made to me some months ago, said the defense professor. Do you want someone intelligent to talk to? I will understand if you are not pleasant to be around. The boy shook his head again. No, thank you. Well then, said the defense professor, what about someone who is powerful and not particularly bound by naive scruples? There was a hesitation, and then the boy once more shook his head. Someone who is knowledgeable of much secret lore and magics that some might consider to be unnatural. There was a slight narrowing of the boy's eyes, so imperceptible that someone else might not have. I see, said the defense professor. Go ahead and ask me about it then. I give you my word that I will repeat nothing of it to the others. The boy took a while to speak, and when he did it was in a cracked voice. I mean to bring Hermione back. Because there isn't an afterlife, and I'm not about to just let her just not be. The boy pressed his hands over his face, and when he withdrew them, he once more seemed as dispassionate as the man standing in the corner. The defense professor's eyes were abstract and faintly puzzled. How? The man said finally. However, I have to. There was another pause. Regardless of the risks, the man in the corner said. Regardless of how dangerous the magic required to accomplish it. Yes. The defense professor's eyes were thoughtful. But what general approach did you have in mind? I presume that turning her corpse into an inferius is not what you— Would she be able to think? The boy said. Would her body still decay? No and yes. Then no. What of the resurrection stone of Cadmus Peverell if it could be obtained for you? The boy shook his head. I don't want an illusion of Hermione drawn from my memories. I want her to be able to live her life. The boy's voice cracked. I haven't decided yet on an object-level angle of attack. If I have to brute force the problem by acquiring enough power and knowledge to just make it happen, I will. Another pause. And to go about that, the man in the corner said, you will use your favorite tool, science. Of course. The defense professor exhaled, almost like a sigh. I suppose that makes sense of it. Are you willing to help or not? The boy said. What help do you seek? Magic. Where does it come from? I do not know, said the man. And neither does anyone else. Oh, the situation is far worse than that, Mr. Potter. There is hardly a scholar of the esoteric who has not unraveled the nature of magic, and every one of them believes something different. Where do new spells come from? I keep reading about someone who invented a spell to do something or other, but there's no mention of how. A shrug of robed shoulders. Where do new books come from, Mr. Potter? Those who read many books sometimes become able to write them in turn. How? No one knows. There are books on how to write. Reading them will not make you a famous playwright. After all such advice is accounted for, what remains is mystery. The invention of new spells is a similar mystery of purer form. The man's head tilted. Such endeavors are dangerous. The saying is that one should either not have children or else wait until after they are grown. There is a reason why so many innovators seem to hail from Gryffindor rather than Ravenclaw as might be expected. And the more powerful sorts of magics, the boy said. A legendary wizard might invent one sacrificial ritual in his life and pass on the knowledge to his heirs. To try inventing 5 such would be suicide. That is why wizards of true power are those who have acquired ancient lore. The boy nodded distantly. So much for the direct solution, then. It would have been nice to just invent a spell for raise dead, become guard, or summon terminal. Do you know anything about Atlantis? Only what any scholar knows, the man said dryly. If you would like to hear about the top 18 standard theories, do not glare at me, Mr. Potter. If it were that simple, I would have done it many years earlier. I understand. Sorry. There was a time of silence. The defense professor's gaze rested on the boy. The boy stared off seemingly at nothing. There's some magics I mean to learn. Spells I could have used earlier today if I'd thought to study them beforehand. The boy's voice was cold. Spells I'll need if this sort of thing goes on happening. Most I expect I can just look up. Some I expect I can't. The defense professor inclined his head. I shall teach you almost any magic you wish to know, Mr. Potter. I do have some limits, but you may always ask. But what specifically do you seek? You lack the raw power for the killing curse, and most other spells deemed forbidden. That spell of cursed fire. I don't suppose it's a sacrificial ritual that even a child could use, if he dared. The defense professor's lips twitched. It requires the permanent sacrifice of a drop of blood. Your body would be lighter by that drop of blood from that day forward. Not the sort of thing one would wish to do often, Mr. Potter. Strength of will is demanded for the cursed fire not to turn upon you and consume you. The usual practice is to first test one's will in lesser trials. And although it is not a primary element of the ritual, I am afraid that it does require more magic than you shall possess for another few years. Pity, the boy said. It would have been nice to see the look on the enemy's face the next time they tried using a troll. The defense professor inclined his head, his lips twitching again. What about memory charms? The Weasley twins were acting oddly, and the headmaster said he thinks they've been obliviated. It seems to be one of the enemy's favorite tricks. Rule 8, said the defense professor. Any technique which is good enough to defeat me once is good enough to learn myself. The boy smiled humorlessly. And I once heard about an adult casting Obliviate while she was almost completely drained, so it must not take too much magic to cast. It's not even considered unforgivable, though I can't imagine why not. If I could have made Mr. Hagrid remember a different set of orders. It is not that straightforward, said the defense professor. You are not powerful enough to use the false memory charm, and even a simple obliviation will stretch the edge of your current stamina. It is a dangerous art, illegal to use without ministry authorization, and I would caution you not to use it under circumstances where it would be inconvenient to accidentally erase 10 years of someone's life. I wish I could promise you that I would obtain one of those highly guarded tomes from the Department of Mysteries and pass it to you beneath a disguised cover. But what I must actually tell you is that you will find the standard introductory text in the Northwest stacks of the main Hogwarts library, filed under M. Seriously, the boy said flatly. Indeed. Thank you for your guidance, Professor. Your creativity has become a great deal more practical, Mr. Potter, since I have known you. Thank you for the compliment. The boy did not look up from where he was again, gazing down at the wand held between his hands. I would like to go back to thinking now. Please explain to them on my behalf what happens if I am disturbed. The door to the storeroom clicked open, and Professor Quirrell stepped out. His face had a dead, emotionless look to it. She would have said that it reminded her of Severus, though Severus had never looked quite like that. Even as the door clicked shut again, Minerva had thrown up a wordless, quieting barrier. The words spilled forth from her rapidly. How did it go? You were in there for a while. Is Harry talking now? Professor Quirrell paced swiftly across the room to the far wall near the entrance, looked back at her. The emotionlessness slid off his face, as though he were taking off a mask, leaving behind someone very grim. I spoke to Mr. Potter as he expected me to speak, and avoided saying things that would annoy him. I do not think it consoled him. I do not think I have the knack. Thank you, it is good that he spoke at all, she hesitated. What did Mr. Potter say? I am afraid that I promised him not to speak of it, and now, I think that I must visit the Hogwarts library. The library? Yes, Professor Quirrell said. An uncharacteristic tension had come into his voice. I intend to strengthen the security upon the restricted section with certain precautions of my own devising. The current wards are a joke, and Mr. Potter must be kept out of the restricted section at all costs. She stared at the defense professor, her heart suddenly in her throat. Professor Quirrell continued speaking. You will not tell the boy that I have said this much to you. You will confirm to Flitwick and Vector that the boy is to be diverted by the usual evasions if he asks precocious questions about spell creation. And though it is not my own area of expertise, Deputy Headmistress, if there is any way you can imagine to convince the boy to stop sinking further into his grief and madness, any way at all to undo the resolutions he is coming to, then I suggest you resort to it immediately.